It was the summer of 1944, and the Eastern Front was about to erupt with a fury that even seasoned soldiers had never imagined. Operation Bagration was not just another battle, but the greatest offensive of the entire Second World War. A massive Soviet strike that would smash through German lines, shatter entire armies, and rewrite the balance of power in Europe forever. Stretching across Belarus, with vast marshes, rivers and forests as the stage, this campaign saw millions of men, thousands of tanks, and endless artillery unleashed in a coordinated storm designed to annihilate the Wehrmacht's Army Group Center. It was an operation of deception and surprise, where the Soviets masked their intentions so well that when they finally struck, the Germans were caught in a trap from which few would escape. Villages burned, skies thundered with aircraft, and the Red Army's relentless push brought liberation for some and devastation for others. For the German soldiers trapped in encirclements, it became a nightmare of hopeless retreats and desperate last stands. For Soviet troops, it was the moment to avenge years of suffering and drive the invader back toward his homeland. And for civilians, it was both a moment of freedom and another chapter of destruction etched into the soil of Belarus. This is the full, unflinching story of Operation Bagration, Eastern Front's greatest offensive and one of the most decisive campaigns in world history. Stay with us until the end of this documentary, and in the comments, let us know where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. We always love to see where history is being remembered. Stay with us until the end of this documentary, and in the comments, let us know where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. We always love to see where history is being remembered. In the bitter winter of early 1944, the Eastern Front stretched like a scar across the heart of Europe, from the frozen Baltic shores in the north to the snow-dusted plains of Ukraine in the south. For over 2 years, it had been the stage of the largest and most brutal confrontation in human history, where millions of soldiers clashed in battles of unimaginable scale. The Wehrmacht, once the spearhead of conquest, now clung desperately to its positions, its formations thinned by years of relentless combat. Supplies were dwindling, fuel was scarce, and replacements could not keep pace with the losses suffered daily. Villages lay in ruins, their people displaced, enslaved, or murdered, as the war consumed both armies and civilians alike. Stalingrad and Kursk had already torn the mask from German invincibility, exposing the fragility of Hitler's grand gamble in the East. Yet, even in the face of disaster, the Nazi regime demanded its soldiers fight on with fanatical resolve, refusing to concede an inch voluntarily. This stubbornness transformed the front into a wasteland of attrition, where every river and forest became a killing ground. As the new year dawned, the Eastern Front was not merely a line of battle, it was a graveyard of Hitler's ambitions, and the crucible in which the Red Army prepared its decisive strike. The shadow of Stalingrad still loomed heavily over the German High Command in 1944. A year earlier, an entire army of over 300,000 men had been surrounded and annihilated, a catastrophe unprecedented in German military history. The shock reverberated through the Wehrmacht, shattering its aura of invincibility and emboldening the Red Army to press the offensive. Following Stalingrad came the Battle of Kursk, in the summer of 1943, where Germany launched one last desperate attempt at regaining the initiative. With thousands of tanks clashing on the fields of Prokhorovka, the Wehrmacht sought to smash Soviet defenses and reclaim dominance, but instead it bled itself dry. Kursk marked the end of large-scale German offensives in the east, leaving Hitler's armies perpetually on the defensive. In the aftermath, Soviet forces drove westward, liberating cities, reclaiming territory and steadily grinding down German strength. The German soldier, once the predator, had become the prey, retreating step by step under the weight of Soviet industrial and numerical superiority. Stalingrad and Kursk had not only broken armies, they had broken illusions, setting the stage for an even greater catastrophe to come. The year 1944 began with the Red Army pushing relentlessly across a wide front, its momentum building with every successful operation. The Soviet Union had transformed itself into a war machine of staggering proportions, capable of producing tanks, aircraft, and artillery on a scale the Germans could no longer match. Factories in the Urals, safely beyond the reach of Luftwaffe bombers, poured out T-34 tanks by the thousands and Yak fighters by the hundreds each month. The Red Army of 1944 was not the ill-prepared force of 1941. It was hardened, disciplined, and battle-experienced, guided by commanders who had learned from past disasters. Marshals like Zhukov, Rokossovsky, and Konev had mastered the art of large-scale offensives, coordinating infantry, armor, artillery, and air power in ways the Wehrmacht could no longer counter. Soviet logistics, once chaotic, now ensured steady supplies to the front, sustaining offensives that pushed deeper and faster into occupied territory. This relentless advance was fueled not only by military necessity, but by political determination. Stalin demanded nothing less than the total destruction of Hitler's armies on Soviet soil. The Red Army's confidence grew with each victory, and by spring of 1944, it was poised to deliver a blow of unprecedented magnitude. For Germany, the situation was becoming untenable. Army Group Center, which occupied the heart of Belorussia, found itself dangerously overstretched, holding a front far longer than its reduced manpower could realistically defend. Entire divisions consisted of boys barely out of school, and men recalled from civilian life, their training rushed, their morale shaken. Supplies trickled in at a fraction of what was needed, with fuel shortages forcing armored units to remain idle. The Luftwaffe, once a dominant force, was now a shadow of itself, its ranks decimated by years of attrition and Allied bombing raids. German commanders pleaded for reinforcements, but Hitler's obsession with holding every inch of conquered land prevented any meaningful withdrawals or realignments. Army Group Center thus became a brittle shield, stretched thin across forests, rivers, and marshlands, awaiting the inevitable storm. Behind the lines, civilian populations endured unspeakable hardships, as forced labor, executions, and scorched earth policies left villages empty shells. The Wehrmacht's proud divisions, once instruments of lightning war, were now reduced to exhausted formations, clinging to survival in hostile territory. By early 1944, the Eastern Front was no longer a battleground of equals, but a slow-motion disaster for Germany, one that would soon accelerate into catastrophe. The psychological strain on German soldiers was immense, for they knew they were fighting a war that could no longer be won. Letters from the front revealed despair, as men wrote of endless Soviet waves, artillery barrages that shook the earth, and skies filled with enemy aircraft. Many soldiers fought on out of fear, fear of the Gestapo, fear of punishment for retreat, and fear of the Red Army's vengeance should they surrender. Hitler's no step back orders forced commanders to hold untenable positions, condemning their men to slaughter. The once proud Wehrmacht, admired for its tactical brilliance, was now shackled by political interference that forbade initiative and punished pragmatism. This rigid system contrasted sharply with the Red Army's increasing flexibility, as Soviet commanders adapted and maneuvered with growing confidence. The Eastern Front in 1944 was not just a battlefield, it was a crucible of despair for German soldiers, trapped between a dictator's orders and an enemy's unstoppable advance. Each battle was fought less for victory than for delay, buying time at the cost of human lives. The morale of the German army sagged under the weight of futility, setting the stage for collapse. Meanwhile, the Soviet people bore the scars of years of occupation and devastation, and their hunger for vengeance burned as fiercely as their desire for liberation. Villages that had been razed, families torn apart, and atrocities committed by the occupiers fueled an unrelenting will to fight. For civilians behind Soviet lines, the Red Army's advance was not just a military campaign, it was the promise of reclaiming homes, dignity, and survival itself. Partisan movements operated with increasing boldness, sabotaging German supply lines, derailing trains, and assassinating collaborators. Their actions disrupted German logistics and tied down troops that might have been deployed at the front. Soviet propaganda emphasized the righteousness of the struggle, portraying every soldier as part of a historic mission to cleanse the motherland of the invader. This blend of vengeance and patriotism created a reservoir of determination that no setback could drain. The Red Army marched not only with weapons, but with the collective fury of a nation brutalized by war. By 1944, this emotional momentum was as potent as the tanks and guns that rolled westward. Strategically, both sides understood that 1944 would be decisive. For Germany, defeat on the Eastern Front meant collapse, for it could not survive the loss of its armies in the East. For the Soviet Union, victory meant not only reclaiming lost lands, but also advancing into Europe itself, reshaping the balance of power in the post-war world. The Germans still held vast swaths of territory, but these were liabilities as much as assets, stretching their resources to the breaking point. Stalin, ever mindful of the global stage, sought to deliver a blow that would astonish both his enemies and his Western allies. He wanted a triumph that would prove the Red Army's supremacy, secure Soviet influence in Eastern Europe, and demonstrate that it was Moscow, not London or Washington, that would determine the fate of Hitler's Reich. Operation Bagration, though not yet named, was already germinating in the minds of Soviet planners. Its scale would dwarf anything seen before, combining overwhelming force with deception on a level that would paralyze the German command. In 1944, the flames of the Eastern Front were not dying out. They were building toward an inferno. Thus, by early summer 1944, the Eastern Front stood on the brink of transformation. German defenses, hollow and brittle, stretched across Belorussia like a fragile line drawn in the sand. Behind it loomed the vast reserves of the Red Army, prepared to strike with fury and precision. Hitler, blinded by hubris, refused to recognize the danger, convinced that Army Group Center was unassailable. His refusal to allow withdrawals or flexible defenses sealed the fate of hundreds of thousands of his soldiers. On the Soviet side, planners meticulously prepared for what would become the greatest offensive of the war, assembling armies with staggering amounts of artillery, tanks, and aircraft. Civilians whispered of impending liberation, even as they endured the daily horrors of occupation. The world beyond the Eastern Front watched with anticipation, for the Allies were preparing their own great offensive in Normandy, and the question lingered, could the Soviets deliver a blow of equal magnitude? The stage was set, the forces gathered, and the Eastern Front smoldered with tension. The flames of war were about to erupt into a firestorm that would consume Army Group Center and change the course of World War II. In the spring of 1944, Adolf Hitler looked at the sprawling maps of the Eastern Front and made a decision that would prove catastrophic for his empire. Against the advice of seasoned generals, he declared the Army Group Center in Belorussia would stand fast, forming the immovable anchor of German defenses. He believed that this central bastion would block the Red Army's path to Poland and shield Germany's eastern frontier from collapse. Hitler was convinced that as long as Army Group Center held firm, the Soviet steamroller could be blunted, giving him time to recover his strength and strike back. This decision ignored the glaring weaknesses of the position. The front was overextended, undersupplied and manned by divisions, reduced to a fraction of their intended strength. German intelligence underestimated Soviet numbers, dismissing the scale of their buildup as impossible. Hitler's obsession with holding territory blinded him to the tactical flexibility that had once been the Wehrmacht's hallmark. The result was a rigid defense that relied more on his willpower than on reality. In gambling everything on the endurance of Army Group Center, Hitler placed the future of his Eastern Front on crumbling foundations. Army Group Center had become the cornerstone of German military pride, a symbol of resilience after years of fighting. Stationed in Belorussia, it guarded the heartland of Hitler's conquests, shielding the approaches to Warsaw and the routes toward East Prussia. Its position gave the illusion of strength, a central bulwark that could support both northern and southern flanks if needed. Yet behind this illusion lay exhaustion. Divisions that had once marched into Russia in 1941 with full strength were now shadows of themselves, drained by attrition and starved of reinforcements. Equipment shortages meant tanks were often immobile for lack of fuel, while artillery units rationed shells to a handful per day. Field fortifications existed, but were patchy, and the swampy terrain of Belorussia made rapid movement or retreat almost impossible. Despite this, Hitler declared the area sacrosanct, an untouchable part of the Reich's defensive line. His belief in Army Group Center's symbolic importance outweighed practical considerations. By insisting it remain immovable, he transformed it from a shield into a trap. Warnings poured in from German generals, men hardened by years of war and acutely aware of the dangers. Commanders like Field Marshal Ernst Busch, leading Army Group Center, and his subordinates repeatedly emphasized the growing strength of the Red Army opposite their lines. Reconnaissance revealed Soviet troop movements, partisan activity intensified, and intercepted communications hinted at a massive buildup. Yet every report that reached Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia was either dismissed or twisted to fit his preconceptions. He believed the main Soviet attack would come elsewhere, perhaps against Army Group North in the Baltic or Army Group South in Ukraine. This miscalculation was the product of both Soviet deception and Hitler's own stubbornness, which had grown into an ironclad refusal to heed professional advice. Generals who pressed the issue too firmly were shouted down or replaced, their expertise discarded in favor of Hitler's instinct. The result was a high command gripped by paralysis, unable to adapt to reality. Army Group Center, already brittle, was left exposed to the hammer blow that was coming. Hitler's fixation on holding every inch of ground was born out of both ideology and fear. He believed that any retreat, however small, would embolden Germany's enemies and weaken his hold on the German people. Memories of the retreat from Russia in 1918 haunted him, shaping his conviction that withdrawal meant collapse. By 1944, he had enshrined a doctrine of no step back, issuing orders that forbade any commander from surrendering territory without his direct approval. For Army Group Center, this meant no flexibility in defense, no elastic withdrawal, and no ability to shorten the line. The Wehrmacht's traditional strength, its ability to maneuver, trade space for time, and strike back with concentrated force, was effectively strangled. Soldiers on the ground understood the folly of the order, but disobedience was unthinkable, as the Gestapo watched even senior officers for signs of dissent. Hitler's gamble was rooted not in military science but in political symbolism. He demanded that the army hold the ground of Belorussia as proof of German willpower. Yet in clinging to the land, he set the stage for its loss on an unimaginable scale. The composition of Army Group Center further revealed its fragility. By early 1944, it consisted of 4 armies: the 3rd Panzer Army, 4th Army, 9th Army, and 2nd Army, stretching over a front of nearly 600 miles. On paper, these armies represented hundreds of thousands of men, but in reality, many divisions were reduced to skeleton formations. Infantry battalions often mustered fewer than 300 men, while tank units counted only a handful of operational vehicles. Communications were strained, supply lines vulnerable, and reserves non-existent. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, was massing 4 powerful fronts, each the equivalent of an army group opposite this weakened force. The disparity in manpower and firepower was staggering, yet Hitler dismissed concerns with characteristic arrogance. He claimed that German soldiers, with their discipline and fighting spirit, could compensate for numerical inferiority. This belief ignored the exhaustion, the dwindling morale, and the sheer imbalance of resources. Army Group Center was less an anchor than a brittle reed, poised to snap under pressure. Hitler's strategic blindness was compounded by his refusal to integrate the Wehrmacht plans with the broader reality of the war. In June 1944, the Allies were preparing to land in Normandy, opening a Western front that would demand German attention and resources. Yet Hitler, obsessed with symbolism, poured men and material into defending occupied France while leaving Army Group Center to wither. He viewed the Western Allies as the greater threat politically, but underestimated the Red Army's capacity for coordinated offensives. This misjudgment left his Eastern armies dangerously exposed at the very moment when they needed reinforcement the most. High-ranking officers urged him to shift armored divisions eastward to bolster defenses in Belorussia, but he refused. Hitler's attention remained divided, his strategic vision clouded by ideology, hubris, and mistrust of his generals. As a result, Army Group Center was tasked with holding an impossible line with insufficient strength. The gamble was clear. He staked everything on the illusion of immovability, a decision that would soon unleash disaster. The vulnerability of Army Group Center was further exacerbated by its environment. Belorussia's terrain was a nightmare for defenders. Dense forests, swamps, and rivers restricted mobility and made supply difficult. German defensive works, hastily constructed, were often shallow and incomplete, providing only temporary protection. Partisan activity in the rear compounded the strain as Soviet guerrillas sabotaged railways, ambushed convoys, and kept the rear areas in constant turmoil. These partisans effectively acted as a shadow army, harassing the Germans and softening them up for the coming offensive. German soldiers lived under the constant threat of ambush, their already fragile morale chipped away with each attack. Yet Hitler brushed aside the impact of partisan warfare, dismissing it as a nuisance rather than a strategic threat. In reality, the partisans ensured that Army Group Center would face not only the Soviet army from the front, but also sabotage and disruption from behind. The stage was set for collapse, though the High Command refused to see it. The very ground on which they stood was already crumbling beneath their boots. Thus, by early June 1944, Hitler's gamble had taken its full shape. Army Group Center, overstretched, undersupplied, and encircled by threats, was ordered to hold its ground at all costs. German generals knew the danger, but were powerless to alter the course, bound by Hitler's will and the Gestapo's gaze. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, prepared the greatest offensive in its history, quietly massing overwhelming force under the cover of deception. The contrast between the two sides was stark, one blinded by hubris and stubbornness, the other fueled by preparation and cunning. Hitler's refusal to see reality ensured that his army would not only be defeated, but annihilated. Army Group Center was not the fortress he imagined, but a hollow shell awaiting destruction. In gambling everything on this front, Hitler had wagered with Germany's future, and the price would be catastrophic. Operation Bagration was about to begin, and it would expose the folly of his gamble with devastating clarity. By the spring of 1944, Joseph Stalin's eyes were fixed firmly on Belorussia, a region that had endured 3 years of brutal German occupation. It was more than a patch of contested territory. It was the gateway to Poland, to East Prussia, and ultimately to the heart of Hitler's Reich. Stalin understood that the liberation of Belorussia carried immense political and psychological weight. Its towns and villages had been devastated, its people enslaved or murdered, and its forests filled with partisan fighters who longed for the Red Army's return. To strike here would not only cripple the Wehrmacht militarily, but also galvanize Soviet citizens with proof that justice and vengeance were within reach. At the same time, Stalin saw Belorussia as a stepping stone toward reshaping post-war Europe under Soviet influence. The liberation of this land would allow the Red Army to roll westward, pressing into territories that Stalin intended to dominate after the fighting was over. Thus, his ambitions were dual: military destruction of the German occupier and political preparation for Soviet hegemony. Operation Bagration would embody both goals, fusing battlefield triumph with long-term strategic vision. The political stakes of Belorussia's liberation were immense for the Kremlin. For years, Stalin had demanded that his Western allies open a second front in France, arguing that the Soviet Union had borne the brunt of the war alone. With D-Day scheduled for June 1944, Stalin was determined to show that the Red Army could launch its own decisive blow at the same time. This would silence critics who doubted Soviet strength and secure the USSR's place as the dominant force in the Allied coalition. By crushing Army Group Center, Stalin aimed to demonstrate that Moscow, not London or Washington, held the true power to shape the war's outcome. He also sought to send a message to occupied nations, Poles, Czechs, and others, that liberation would come not from Anglo-American armies but from the East, under the banner of the Red Army. This political theater mattered as much as the battlefield itself, for Stalin was already planning for the post-war order. Every Soviet soldier marching westward carried not only a rifle, but also the weight of Soviet influence in the world to come. Militarily, Stalin and his generals envisioned nothing less than the annihilation of Germany's Army Group Center. Unlike previous offensives, which often aimed to reclaim ground or encircle a portion of enemy forces, Operation Bagration was designed as a campaign of total destruction. The Red Army planned to smash through German lines with overwhelming force, encircle entire armies, and shatter their capacity to resist. This meant targeting not just frontline troops, but the entire infrastructure of German defense, communications, supply depots, command posts, and reserves. The scale of preparation was staggering: 4 massive Soviet fronts, comprising over 2.3 million men, 5,200 tanks and self-propelled guns, 31,000 artillery pieces, and nearly 5,000 aircraft. It was the largest offensive of the war in terms of concentrated manpower and firepower, dwarfing even Stalingrad and Kursk. Stalin demanded nothing short of total victory, a blow so devastating that it would break the Wehrmacht's spine on the Eastern Front. His military ambition was clear: to wipe Army Group Center off the map in a single crushing campaign. Preparation for such a colossal undertaking required meticulous planning and coordination across every level of the Soviet military. Marshals like Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky worked with front commanders such as Konstantin Rokossovsky, Ivan Cherniakovsky, and Ivan Bagration to choreograph a synchronized assault. Each front was tasked with a specific role to break through, to encircle, to exploit, and to pursue. Supply depots were filled to bursting with ammunition, fuel, and food, brought forward by railways repaired under constant partisan protection. Engineers laid pontoon bridges across rivers in secret, ready for the storming of enemy defenses. Soviet intelligence coordinated with partisan networks, gathering detailed maps of German fortifications, supply routes, and weak points. The entire Soviet war machine moved in concert, an orchestra of destruction preparing for its greatest performance. This was not the chaotic Red Army of 1941, but a disciplined, methodical force capable of executing a massive operation with precision. Stalin demanded absolute secrecy and absolute success. Nothing was left to chance, for the stakes were nothing less than the destruction of Hitler's strongest army group. Stalin's ambitions were fueled not only by strategy, but by vengeance. Belorussia had been a land of suffering on an unimaginable scale under German occupation. The villages were burned in reprisals, civilians massacred, and entire populations deported to labor camps or killed outright. Over 2 million people had perished, many in the extermination camps and ghettos that scarred the region. For Stalin, liberating Belorussia was both a military necessity and a political promise to avenge these atrocities. Propaganda emphasized the suffering of the people, portraying the Red Army as both liberator and executioner of justice. Soldiers were told they carried the duty to restore dignity to the homeland and to exact revenge on the invaders. This emotional dimension infused the preparations with a sense of righteous fury. Stalin harnessed both ideology and vengeance, blending them into the fuel that powered his colossal offensive. The liberation of Belorussia would not merely be a strategic victory, it would be an act of retribution written in blood and fire. The Soviet leadership also understood that timing was critical. Stalin wanted Operation Bagration to coincide with the Allied landings in Normandy, creating a two-front catastrophe for Hitler. By launching in late June, the Red Army would not only exploit German weakness, but also demonstrate its role as an equal partner in the global coalition against fascism. This synchronization was more than symbolic. It forced Germany to divide its resources and attention between East and West. While Allied soldiers stormed the beaches of France, Soviet soldiers would tear open the heart of Hitler's defenses in the East. This coordination highlighted Stalin's shrewd political sense. He wanted to prove to Roosevelt and Churchill that the Soviet Union was indispensable in the war effort. The ambition was to secure both battlefield glory and diplomatic leverage. Stalin's vision extended beyond the guns and tanks of 1944 to the conference tables of the post-war world. Every victory in Belorussia would strengthen his hand in shaping the map of Europe. Yet Stalin's ambitions were not without risk. The sheer scale of Operation Bagration meant that failure would have catastrophic consequences. If the Germans anticipated the attack and reinforced Army Group Center, Soviet armies could find themselves bogged down in costly battles, bleeding manpower and equipment. The Red Army's numerical superiority was immense, but its soldiers would still have to cross rivers, breach entrenched defenses, and fight in difficult terrain. A stalemate would undermine Stalin's political goals, weaken Soviet prestige, and embolden Hitler. Soviet planners therefore invested heavily in deception, maskirovka, to conceal their true intentions. False radio traffic, fake troop movements, and carefully planted intelligence convinced the Germans that the main offensive would fall elsewhere, particularly in Ukraine. Stalin gambled boldly, but unlike Hitler, his gamble was based on careful preparation, overwhelming resources, and psychological manipulation. The ambitions were immense, but so too was the confidence that this time the Red Army could deliver. By June 1944, Stalin's ambitions had crystallized into the grand design of Operation Bagration. It was not merely a campaign, it was a declaration of Soviet strength, vengeance, and political destiny. The Red Army would march westward with overwhelming force, annihilate Army Group Center, liberate Belorussia, and open the road to Poland and beyond. The offensive would prove to the world that the Soviet Union was not only surviving but dominating, shaping the course of the war and the post-war order. Stalin's determination was absolute. The campaign would be the hammer blow that broke the Wehrmacht in the east. In his vision, every destroyed German division was not only a military triumph, but a symbol of Soviet supremacy. The ambitions of Operation Bagration stretched far beyond the battlefield. They reached into the very future of Europe. And as the Soviet war machine gathered its strength, Stalin prepared to unleash the greatest offensive the world had ever seen, one that would forever change the course of history. No operation in World War II demonstrated the art of deception more masterfully than the Soviet preparations for Operation Bagration. The Red Army knew that overwhelming force alone was not enough to ensure total victory. They had to convince the Germans to look in the wrong direction. This strategy, known as maskirovka, was deeply ingrained in Soviet military doctrine, combining camouflage, false intelligence, and elaborate ruses to mislead the enemy. Stalin and his generals realized that if the Germans reinforced Army Group Center, the offensive might bog down into a costly struggle. But if the Wehrmacht believed the main blow would fall elsewhere, perhaps in Ukraine or even in the south toward Romania, the heart of Belorussia would be left exposed. Thus began one of the greatest deception campaigns of the war, one that would rival and even surpass the Allies' famous Operation Bodyguard in the West. The Soviets poured immense effort into crafting illusions, building fake armies, planting misleading radio traffic, and feeding false information to German intelligence. In the end, their deception would leave Army Group Center isolated, unreinforced, and fatally vulnerable. The first layer of Soviet deception was physical camouflage, carried out on a staggering scale. Entire tank armies were concealed in forests, hidden under freshly cut branches, and carefully arranged netting that blended with the terrain. Artillery batteries were positioned under false coverings, while decoy gun emplacements were built in open fields to draw German reconnaissance. Supply depots were disguised as civilian farms or abandoned villages, their tracks covered by straw to avoid detection from the air. Rail movements were conducted at night, with engines muffled and lights blacked out, ensuring that thousands of troops and weapons could shift without betraying their positions. Meanwhile, dummy formations made of wooden tanks, papier-mâché aircraft, and even scarecrow-like soldiers were constructed in Ukraine to suggest a massive buildup in the south. To German aerial reconnaissance, these false formations appeared convincing, further cementing the illusion that the Soviet hammer would fall elsewhere. Maskirovka turned the very landscape into an accomplice, hiding truth behind a veil of shadows and smoke. Equally important was the manipulation of German intelligence through false radio traffic. Soviet radio operators flooded the airwaves with misleading chatter, simulating the presence of entire divisions that did not exist. Messages were transmitted with deliberate patterns, mimicking the communications of real units long enough to convince German codebreakers of their authenticity. In Ukraine especially, fake radio signals created the impression of a massive armored buildup, poised to strike westward into Poland or south toward the oil fields of Romania. Meanwhile, actual Soviet formations massing in Belorussia maintained strict radio silence, their movements concealed in the stillness of the ether. This silence, paradoxically, was interpreted by German analysts as weakness, reinforcing their belief that the Central Front was not under imminent threat. The deception was not just about creating false images, it was about filling German ears with convincing lies and leaving their eyes blind to reality. Human intelligence played a role as well, with carefully crafted misinformation fed through double agents and captured spies. The Soviets skillfully manipulated German expectations, providing just enough truth to make the lies believable. Reports from occupied territories suggested partisan activity was intensifying in Ukraine, subtly hinting at an impending offensive there. Meanwhile, rumors were planted of Soviet logistical difficulties in the north, suggesting they lacked the strength to strike Army Group Center. Even deserters captured by the Germans were sometimes deliberately allowed to escape with misleading stories of Soviet intentions. This interplay of truth and fiction created a fog of uncertainty, one that tilted German planners toward the wrong conclusions. By the time Operation Bagration approached, the Abwehr and Wehrmacht High Command were convinced that the Red Army's next great blow would fall in the south. Army Group Center, ironically the true target, was left dangerously neglected. The role of Soviet partisans in Maskirovka was indispensable. Operating deep behind German lines, they not only sabotaged railways and communications, but also spread deliberate misinformation. Partisans staged mock attacks in areas that the Soviets wanted the Germans to view as threatened, drawing attention away from Belorussia. They also intercepted German patrols and left behind falsified maps and documents pointing to offensives in Ukraine. In reality, these same partisans were also preparing to play a direct role in the coming offensive by crippling German logistics in Belorussia. But in the months leading up to June 1944, their role as actors in the theater of deception was just as critical. By making noise in one direction, they allowed the Soviet Juggernaut to assemble quietly in another. Hitler's forces were not only blinded by false information, but deafened by the deliberate echoes of partisan mischief. At the highest levels of the Soviet command, the deception effort was coordinated with meticulous precision. Marshals Zhukov and Vasilevsky oversaw the grand plan, ensuring that every element of the Red Army contributed to the illusion. False offensives were even staged, with probing attacks launched in Ukraine to reinforce German suspicions. Simultaneously, political propaganda hinted at operations aimed at liberating key cities in the south, further drawing German attention away from the Central Front. This multi-layered deception was synchronized with maskirovka at the tactical level, where ordinary soldiers played their part by maintaining secrecy and spreading deliberate falsehoods. Even Stalin himself encouraged the ruse, publicly praising Soviet successes in the south, while maintaining silence about Belorussia. The deception was not an afterthought, it was central to the operation's design. By combining camouflage, misinformation, and psychological manipulation, the Soviets ensured that when the hammer fell, it would fall on an unsuspecting enemy. The success of Maskirovka was measured in the decisions made by the German High Command. When requests came to reinforce Army Group Center, Hitler and his generals refused, convinced that the danger lay elsewhere. Precious armored divisions were shifted southward toward Ukraine and Romania, leaving the Central Front fatally underdefended. Reconnaissance flights over Belorussia reported little movement, reinforcing the illusion of Soviet weakness. German staff officers at OKH Army High Command confidently assessed that the Red Army lacked the strength to launch a major offensive against Army Group Center. Their misplaced certainty was the direct result of Soviet deception, which had turned their intelligence apparatus into an unwitting accomplice. Maskirovka had not only fooled the enemy, it had shaped their strategy. The Germans were walking blindly into disaster, guided by false images and whispered lies. By June 1944, The deception was complete. Hitler's attention was divided between the looming Allied invasion in the west and supposed Soviet buildups in the south. Army Group Center, positioned in Belorussia, was dismissed as secure, its danger underestimated and its pleas for reinforcements ignored. The Red Army, concealed by forests, rivers, and an intricate web of lies, stood ready with overwhelming strength. When Operation Bagration began on June 22nd, the third anniversary of Operation Barbarossa, it struck an enemy utterly unprepared for the scale of destruction about to unfold. Maskirovka had achieved its purpose. The Germans were deceived at every level, strategically, operationally, and tactically. What followed was not merely a battle, but a catastrophe for the Wehrmacht, born from Stalin's ambition and the Red Army's mastery of deception. The mask had hidden the truth long enough, and now with the ruse complete, the hammer of vengeance was ready to fall. In the spring of 1944, the German High Command, the Oberkommando des Heeres, or OKH, sat in Berlin convinced that they understood the Soviet Union's next move. Their intelligence analysts, fed by reports from the Abwehr and aerial reconnaissance, believed that the Soviet threat lay primarily in the south. Ukraine, with its fertile plains and vital oil fields in Romania, seemed the logical target for a major Soviet offensive. This belief, reinforced by deception carefully planted by the Red Army, grew into near certainty among Hitler's generals. Belorussia, held by Army Group Center, was considered a quiet sector, the least likely to host a Soviet storm. The terrain, with its forests, rivers, and swamps, was seen as unfavorable for large-scale tank operations. For the OKH, the logic was simple. The Soviets would attack where resources mattered most, not in a swampy backwater. This assumption, repeated in staff meetings and situation reports, was to prove disastrous. The blindness of the OKH was not simply a product of deception, but also of arrogance. German commanders had convinced themselves that the Red Army was incapable of sophisticated planning or large-scale coordination. Despite defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk, many in Berlin still viewed the Soviets as crude, reliant on sheer numbers rather than strategy. They believed that the Wehrmacht's professionalism and discipline gave it a permanent edge, one that could offset even the Soviets' growing industrial strength. Such arrogance created a mental blind spot, making it difficult for German officers to recognize the scale of the Red Army's transformation since 1941. Even as intelligence reports hinted at vast Soviet buildups in Belorussia, these were dismissed as exaggerated or inaccurate. The German High Command saw what it wished to see, an enemy that was still inferior, still predictable, still incapable of launching a truly decisive blow. Intelligence failures compounded this arrogance. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights, while extensive, struggled to penetrate the dense forests and carefully camouflaged Soviet positions in Belorussia. Dummy formations in Ukraine diverted precious aerial resources, ensuring that what reconnaissance planes did capture only confirmed German assumptions. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, had been deeply compromised, riddled with inefficiencies, and infiltrated by Allied deception efforts. Reports from the front were filtered through layers of bureaucracy, often arriving too late or heavily edited to fit prevailing assumptions. When commanders in Army Group Center requested reinforcements or warned of unusual Soviet activity, their concerns were often dismissed or minimized at higher levels. The OKH was less an intelligence hub than an echo chamber, where data was bent to fit conclusions already drawn. By June 1944, this system had left the Germans dangerously blind. At the heart of the blindness stood Adolf Hitler himself. Obsessed with holding ground at any cost, Hitler had transformed strategic discussions into monologues of his own convictions. He dismissed warnings from generals who suggested that Army Group Center was vulnerable, berating them as defeatists. His fixation on the South, particularly Ukraine and Romania, reflected both economic priorities and personal stubbornness. Hitler clung to the belief that oil was the lifeblood of the war, and that the Soviets would inevitably strike to capture it. This conviction overrode all other possibilities, shaping the allocation of reinforcements and resources. Divisions that might have bolstered Army Group Center were instead shifted southward, leaving the Central Front dangerously undermanned. In Hitler's mind, Belorussia was secure, a quiet sector that required little attention. This fatal misjudgment left his strongest army group exposed to the greatest Soviet blow of the war. The organizational culture of the German High Command further reinforced this blindness. Officers were reluctant to challenge Hitler's views directly, fearing his wrath and the consequences of dissent. Those who dared voice concerns often found themselves sidelined, reassigned, or ignored. As a result, planning sessions became exercises in confirmation rather than critical analysis. Reports that supported Hitler's beliefs were highlighted, while contradictory evidence was buried or softened. This culture of obedience and fear created an environment where truth was subordinated to ideology. In effect, the Wehrmacht's leadership blinded itself, unable or unwilling to see the storm gathering on the horizon. Even seasoned generals, who privately doubted Hitler's assumptions, publicly conformed to his narrative. The blindness of the High Command was not only strategic, it was institutional, embedded in the very structure of Nazi decision-making. Meanwhile, the men of Army Group Center were left with a false sense of security. Soldiers dug trenches, manned bunkers, and patrolled the forests of Belorussia. But they were not reinforced with the tanks, artillery, or reserves they desperately needed. Many officers on the ground sensed danger, aware that Soviet activity was increasing across the lines. Partisan attacks had escalated in intensity, railways were constantly sabotaged, and Soviet reconnaissance patrols grew bolder. Yet their warnings were dismissed as local concerns, irrelevant to the broader strategic picture. For the men in the trenches, this disconnect was bewildering. They faced a growing enemy presence, but their superiors insisted that the real threat lay hundreds of miles to the south. When the Soviet offensive finally came, this sense of being abandoned by the High Command would add bitterness to the despair. By June 1944, the consequences of this blindness were stark. Army Group Center, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, stood exposed with little hope of reinforcement. It consisted of 4 armies stretched thin across a vast front, reliant on outdated defenses and dwindling supplies. In contrast, the Soviets had amassed overwhelming superiority in men, tanks, artillery, and aircraft. The imbalance was not simply numerical, but psychological. The Red Army was prepared, motivated, and coordinated, while the Wehrmacht was complacent, misled, and overconfident. The German High Command had failed to anticipate the scale of the coming storm, and in doing so had condemned its soldiers to disaster. When Operation Bagration began, the mismatch would be so extreme that it stunned even the Soviets themselves. The blindness of the German High Command was one of the defining causes of the catastrophe that followed. By misreading Soviet intentions, dismissing intelligence, and clinging to arrogance, the OKH set the stage for one of the greatest defeats in military history. Hitler's stubbornness and obsession with the South, combined with a culture of obedience and fear, left Army Group Center fatally exposed. The Germans had every opportunity to see the truth, but they chose illusion over reality. In June 1944, the veil would be torn away in a storm of fire and steel. The Red Army's offensive would not simply be a battle. It would be a reckoning for the blindness of German command. What had been ignored, denied, or rationalized in Berlin would soon explode across Belorussia, shattering the Wehrmacht and altering the course of the war. By the spring of 1944, the Soviet Union had transformed itself into a war-making machine of astonishing scale and efficiency. The Red Army, bloodied and tested by years of brutal conflict, stood poised to unleash the largest offensive in modern history. At its core was a vast arsenal of tanks, artillery, aircraft, and infantry divisions, all meticulously organized and supplied for Operation Bagration. Soviet industry, relocated east of the Urals and shielded from German bombing, had poured out weapons at a staggering pace. T-34 tanks rolled off assembly lines in the tens of thousands, their rugged design perfectly suited to the terrain of Belorussia. Artillery, the god of war in Soviet doctrine, was massed in unprecedented concentrations, ready to pound German defenses into rubble. Aircraft, from nimble fighters like the Yak-9 to deadly ground attack planes like the Il-2 Sturmovik, filled the skies in numbers that dwarfed the Luftwaffe. This juggernaut was not a spontaneous force, but the product of years of sacrifice, organization, and planning. Every element was geared toward overwhelming Army Group Center and sweeping the Red Army westward. The backbone of the offensive was the Soviet tank arm, which had matured into a formidable instrument of war by 1944. At the heart of this force was the T-34, a medium tank renowned for its reliability, mobility, and adaptability. Supported by heavy tanks like the IS-2, capable of crushing German Tigers and Panthers in duels, the Soviet armored formations embodied a philosophy of mass and momentum. Entire tank armies were concentrated behind the front, poised to exploit breakthroughs once infantry and artillery had torn open German lines. These armored units were not scattered piecemeal, but held in reserve as a decisive striking force, ensuring that once the Wehrmacht cracked, the Red Army could pour through and drive deep into enemy territory. Engineers prepared routes for these tanks, laying pontoon bridges and reinforcing roads so that armored thrusts would not falter. By June 1944, the Red Army's armored juggernaut was not only vast in size, but perfectly positioned to deliver a knockout blow. If tanks were the spearhead, then artillery was the hammer. The Red Army assembled more than 31,000 artillery pieces and rocket launchers for the offensive, a concentration that dwarfed anything the Germans could muster. Katyusha rocket batteries, with their howling barrages, were massed alongside traditional field guns and heavy mortars. Entire artillery divisions were positioned wheel to wheel, their barrels aimed westward, ready to unleash storms of fire. Soviet doctrine emphasized rolling barrages, walls of explosives that advanced ahead of infantry, crushing German positions in waves. The sheer weight of firepower meant that German bunkers, trenches, and machine gun nests would be obliterated before Soviet soldiers advanced. This artillery preparation was coordinated with precision, timed to silence enemy batteries and sever communications at the exact moment infantry and armor surged forward. In the words of many German survivors, the Soviet artillery barrage of June 1944 resembled not a military assault, but the fury of nature itself, a man-made thunderstorm that left defenders stunned and broken. Equally critical was the Red Air Force, which by 1944 had achieved dominance over the skies of the Eastern Front. Nearly 5,000 aircraft were assigned to support Operation Bagration, ranging from nimble fighters like the Yakovlev Yak-9 and Lavokshin La-5 to the ground-shattering Il-2 Sturmovik, nicknamed the Flying Tank. The Il-2 Sed were deployed in massive squadrons, tasked with strafing German columns, destroying supply convoys, and smashing fortified positions. Fighter aircraft, meanwhile, would sweep the skies clear of the Luftwaffe, ensuring that German reconnaissance was blinded and their bombers unable to interfere. This air supremacy was achieved not only through numbers, but through improved pilot training, better coordination with ground forces, and an air doctrine that emphasized overwhelming localized superiority. Soviet air units worked hand in hand with artillery observers, feeding real-time data into the barrages. For German defenders, the sky itself became hostile, filled with the roar of engines and the fire of machine guns. The Red Air Force had matured into a true partner of the ground armies, ensuring that the Soviet Juggernaut advanced under an umbrella of near-total aerial dominance. Behind the front lines, the Red Army mobilized an immense logistical apparatus to sustain the offensive. Railroads, repaired and extended by tireless engineers, delivered endless supplies of ammunition, fuel, and food to forward depots. Trucks and horse-drawn carts ferried material the last few miles, ensuring that the spearheads would never run dry at the decisive moment. Engineers laid pontoon bridges across rivers under cover of darkness, allowing tanks and artillery to move forward undetected. Fuel depots were camouflaged, ammunition was stockpiled in hidden caches, and field hospitals were established to treat the wounded with unprecedented efficiency. This logistical backbone represented a sharp departure from the chaos of 1941, when Soviet armies often starved of supplies in the midst of battle. By 1944, the Red Army had mastered the art of sustaining mass offensives, ensuring that the momentum of Bagration would not falter. In many ways it was logistics, as much as tanks or artillery, that transformed the Soviet military into an unstoppable juggernaut. At the operational level, the coordination of four massive fronts was a feat of organization unmatched in military history. The First Baltic Front under General Ivan Bagramian, the First Belarusian Front under Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky, the Second Belarusian Front under General Georgy Zakharov, and the Third Belarusian Front under General Ivan Cherniakovsky, each commanded hundreds of thousands of troops. Their roles were carefully choreographed. Rokossovsky's armies would smash through at Bobruisk, Cherniakovsky's would strike near Vitebsk, Bagramian would envelop from the north, and Zakharov would support with pressure from the south. These movements were not isolated thrusts, but part of a grand design of encirclement, trapping entire German armies in vast pockets. Coordination was maintained through centralized planning by Marshals Zhukov and Vasilevsky, who ensured that each front's timetable meshed perfectly with the others. This synchronization of effort turned the Red Army into a single massive organism, striking with unity and precision. For the Germans, accustomed to exploiting Soviet disorganization in earlier years, this level of coordination was both shocking and deadly. Soviet preparation also extended to the psychological conditioning of its soldiers. Propaganda units toured the front, reminding men of the atrocities committed in Belorussia, the burned villages, the murdered civilians, the enslaved children. Soldiers were told that they were not only liberators but avengers, carrying justice in their rifles and tanks. Political commissars ensured ideological unity, while veterans of earlier battles shared their experiences to steel new recruits. Training exercises rehearsed the assaults, with mock-ups of German fortifications built and stormed repeatedly. Soldiers were drilled in the use of bayonets, grenades, and anti-tank weapons, ensuring that when the moment came, they would act with both fury and discipline. This psychological preparation imbued the Red Army with a sense of destiny, a belief that the liberation of Belorussia was not just a military task, but a sacred duty. When the offensive began, the Soviets advanced not merely as soldiers but as instruments of national vengeance. By June 1944, The Red Army Juggernaut stood ready, its every element primed for destruction. Tanks and artillery massed silently in forests, camouflaged from German eyes. Aircraft waited on airstrips, fueled and armed for relentless strikes. Engineers had laid the paths for advance, and logistics officers had filled depots with supplies to sustain weeks of combat. 4 vast fronts waited for the signal, each commander aware of his role in the grand design. At the strategic level, Stalin and his marshals watched with grim confidence, knowing they had assembled the most powerful military force yet seen in Europe. This was not the desperate Red Army of 1941, but a machine honed by 3 years of war, reinforced by industry, and guided by experience. The Germans, blinded by arrogance and deception, had left themselves exposed. Now the Juggernaut prepared to roll forward, carrying with it the fate of Belorussia, the destruction of Army Group Center, and the turning of the Eastern Front forever. The impending collision in Belorussia in June 1944 was not simply a confrontation of men and machines. It was a clash of 2 fundamentally different military doctrines. On one side stood the Soviet concept of glubokaya operatsiya, or deep battle, a theory forged in the 1920s and tested brutally since 1941. It emphasized overwhelming the enemy with massed firepower, multiple thrusts, and relentless depth of attack that would paralyze the entire defensive system. On the other side, the Germans clung to their traditional doctrine of elastic defense, honed in earlier wars and refined on the Eastern Front. This approach emphasized holding ground with strong points, delaying attacks, and then counterstriking with mobile reserves. The difference was philosophical as much as tactical. The Soviets aimed to destroy the enemy as a system, while the Germans sought to blunt attacks and preserve their strength for decisive counterblows. In Belorussia, these opposing theories would meet in a contest that exposed the weaknesses of one and validated the maturity of the other. Soviet deep battle theory envisioned war not as a series of isolated clashes, but as a continuous sequence of blows, delivered in echelon to dismantle the enemy's defenses layer by layer. The first echelon, massed infantry, supported by overwhelming artillery, was designed to break through tactical defenses. Behind them, armored spearheads and mechanized corps formed the second echelon, ready to pour through breaches and drive deep into the enemy's operational rear. Further forces, the third echelon, were kept in reserve to exploit success and continue momentum once initial objectives were achieved. This doctrine was not theoretical by 1944. It had been tested at Kursk, refined in Ukraine, and perfected in planning for Bagration. Its strength lay in synchronization, artillery, armor, air power, and infantry working as parts of a single coordinated machine. The Germans, by contrast, were still fighting with methods that assumed their enemies would exhaust themselves against well-prepared defenses before the Wehrmacht delivered the killing stroke. German defensive doctrine, shaped by both tradition and necessity, emphasized holding ground through a network of strong points. Instead of continuous trench lines, defenders relied on fortified villages, bunkers, and machine gun nests, linked by fields of fire. These were designed to slow enemy advances and channel them into kill zones where artillery and reserves could inflict maximum casualties. Once the attacker was weakened, mobile divisions, particularly armored units, would counterattack, restoring the line or throwing the enemy back. This doctrine had served the Wehrmacht well earlier in the war, when it could count on veteran formations, plentiful tanks, and air superiority. But by 1944, the circumstances had changed. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. German tank reserves were thin, and Army Group Center had no depth of defense in Belorussia. What had once been an effective method of warfare was now a brittle shell, ill-suited to withstand the weight of the Soviet Juggernaut. The key difference lay in the use of reserves. German doctrine assumed that a strong armoured reserve could be shifted rapidly to any threatened sector, delivering decisive counterblows. This method relied on accurate intelligence, efficient command, and the ability to move freely behind the front. In Belorussia, all three conditions were absent. Soviet maskirovka had blinded the Germans, reserves were positioned too far away due to Hitler's fixation on other theatres, and partisan sabotage crippled the railways needed for rapid redeployment. By contrast, Soviet doctrine did not depend on reactive maneuvers. It built momentum from the start, planning for successive phases of attack that flowed seamlessly into each other. Once the Red Army broke through, German reserves would not find weakened enemies, but fresh armoured echelons already surging forward. The mismatch between these doctrines was fatal. The Germans were waiting for opportunities that never came, while the Soviets created opportunities with each synchronized blow. Another stark contrast was in the role of firepower. The Soviets believed in overwhelming preparation. Artillery barrages measured not in minutes, but in hours, saturating enemy positions with explosives until defenders were stunned or annihilated. Entire sectors would be drowned in fire before infantry moved forward, ensuring that even strong points crumbled. German doctrine, however, relied on economy of firepower, using well-placed guns to support infantry while conserving ammunition for counterattacks. In Belorussia, the imbalance was staggering. The Red Army massed thousands of guns, mortars, and rocket launchers in carefully coordinated barrages, while German units often had only a handful of artillery pieces to support entire divisions. Where the Soviets turned firepower into a strategic weapon, the Germans treated it as a limited tool. The clash of doctrines meant that German strongpoints, designed to hold until relief arrived, were obliterated before counterattacks could even be considered. Air power highlighted the divergence further. Soviet doctrine by 1944 integrated air forces directly into ground operations, with the Red Air Force tasked to achieve local superiority and to support advancing troops continuously. Ground attack aircraft like the Il-2 were seen as flying artillery, hammering defenses in coordination with barrages. Fighters cleared the skies to protect this effort, ensuring uninterrupted support. German doctrine, by contrast, still envisioned the Luftwaffe as a flexible striking force, capable of massing in one sector for decisive impact. But in Belorussia, the Luftwaffe was crippled by shortages of aircraft, fuel, and pilots, unable to mount more than token resistance. German defenders looked to the skies for relief that never came, while Soviet soldiers advanced under the roar of their own aircraft. The Soviet approach turned the skies into an extension of the battlefield, while the Germans, once masters of air power, were left helpless. The clash of doctrines was also evident in command philosophy. Soviet planning for Bagration emphasized centralized control at the strategic level, with Zhukov and Vasilevsky overseeing the entire operation, but delegated initiative at the front and army level to exploit breakthroughs. Once breaches were made, commanders were encouraged to push relentlessly without waiting for orders, keeping pressure on the enemy. German doctrine traditionally emphasized off-tracks tactic, mission command, allowing lower officers freedom to adapt. But by 1944, this flexibility had been strangled by Hitler's obsession with controlling every detail. Orders to hold ground at all costs left German commanders unable to withdraw, regroup, or maneuver effectively. The Soviets had learned to combine discipline with initiative, while the Germans were shackled by rigidity imposed from above. This contrast meant that when the Soviet tide surged forward, German units could not adapt. They were ordered to stand and die, while the Red Army pressed forward with fluid, relentless momentum. In the end, the doctrinal clash in Belorussia was a contest between dynamism and stagnation. The Soviets had evolved into a modern, integrated force, wielding deep battle with precision and overwhelming resources. The Germans, still relying on doctrines that assumed superiority in mobility and reserves, found themselves paralyzed when those assumptions collapsed. Soviet deep battle aimed not just to win ground, but to dismantle the enemy's ability to resist, and in Army Group Center they found a target perfectly suited to their method. The German defensive system, brittle and under-resourced, could not withstand the synchronized storm of artillery, armor, infantry, and air power. Operation Bagration would prove not only a military disaster for the Wehrmacht, but also a vindication of Soviet doctrine. The Red Army had embraced modern warfare, while the Germans clung to methods that no longer fit the reality of 1944. In Belorussia, doctrine became destiny, and destiny was about to sweep the Eastern Front into a new phase of destruction. At dawn on June 22, 1944, the third anniversary of Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, the Red Army repaid the debt of blood with a vengeance long prepared. As the first light crept across the forests and marshes of Belorussia, the quiet was shattered by the thunder of more than 31,000 Soviet guns. Artillery batteries, stretching for miles, opened fire in unison, saturating German positions with a barrage that shook the earth itself. Villages, trenches, bunkers, and strongpoints erupted under the storm, their defenders thrown into confusion before they could even reach their weapons. The sound carried for dozens of miles, a rolling drumbeat of destruction that announced the beginning of the greatest Soviet offensive of the war. To those who survived, it seemed as if the very ground had turned against them, spitting fire and steel without pause. This was not a probing attack or a limited assault. It was an avalanche, carefully prepared to sweep away everything in its path. The artillery preparation was meticulously planned and executed. Soviet gunners had spent weeks registering their weapons, plotting targets with precision based on aerial reconnaissance and partisan reports. Every known German bunker, trench, supply depot, and artillery position was assigned to batteries tasked with obliterating them in sequence. The barrages were not random, they followed a choreography of destruction, shifting fire from front lines to rear areas, cutting communications and isolating pockets of defenders. Katyusha rocket launchers unleashed their shrieking salvos, saturating wide areas with explosives that demoralized entire German units. Smoke shells obscured observation posts, while heavy guns silenced enemy batteries before they could respond. The effect was devastating. Whole sectors of the front line were paralyzed within minutes, their commanders unable to coordinate or even understand the scale of the assault. The Soviet doctrine of firepower had reached its apotheosis, drowning the enemy in steel before a single infantryman advanced. As the artillery storm raged, the Red Air Force descended in waves, adding to the destruction. Il-2 Sturmovix swept over German trenches, strafing and bombing positions already shattered by the barrages. Fighter bombers targeted convoys, bridges, and command posts, severing the arteries of German defense. Bombers struck deeper, disrupting railways and smashing any hope of reinforcement or retreat. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Soviet skies, could mount only a feeble response. A handful of German fighters rose to challenge the Soviet swarms, but they were overwhelmed by sheer numbers and superior coordination. For the first time on such a scale, the Red Army advanced under total air supremacy, a reversal of fortune unthinkable in 1941. The combination of artillery and air power created an environment where German defenders were not only pinned down, but psychologically broken. They faced annihilation from above and from the ground, with no relief in sight. Following the barrages came the infantry, advancing cautiously but relentlessly through smoke and fire. Soviet rifle divisions surged forward in dense waves, bayonets fixed, supported by machine guns and mortars. Engineers led the way, clearing mines, cutting barbed wire, and building makeshift crossings over rivers and marshes. Behind them, tanks rumbled forward, their tracks crushing through the debris of shattered German defenses. The momentum of the advance was irresistible. Where resistance stiffened, artillery shifted its fire to blast the obstacle away. German soldiers who had survived the bombardment now faced an onslaught of men and machines, their positions overwhelmed by sheer weight of numbers and firepower. Entire platoons were buried alive in their trenches, while others fled only to be cut down in the open. The Soviet infantry pressed on, not stopping to consolidate, but driving ever deeper, fulfilling the doctrine of relentless phased assault. For the German defenders of Army Group Center, the experience was apocalyptic. Soldiers emerging from bunkers after the initial bombardment found their positions obliterated, their commanders missing, and their communications destroyed. Attempts to call for artillery support were met with silence. Guns had been knocked out, their crews dead or fleeing. Field telephones hung useless from shattered poles, wires cut by shellfire. Machine gun nests that had once dominated fields of fire were now smoldering craters. Even those who held their ground faced a terrifying realization they were outnumbered, outgunned, and outflanked before the day had truly begun. Morale crumbled as men abandoned positions, retreating into forests or swamps in the hope of survival. But Soviet forces pursued relentlessly, surrounding isolated pockets and forcing surrenders by the hundreds. What had been assumed to be a quiet sector erupted into a hellscape, where German doctrine of holding at all costs became synonymous with certain death. The psychological impact of the opening blows was as significant as the physical destruction. German soldiers remembered June 22, 1941, when they had been the aggressors, storming into the Soviet Union with confidence of swift victory. Now, exactly 3 years later, they were the ones caught in a tidal wave of destruction, powerless to resist. The symbolism of the date was not lost on either side. Soviet propaganda units broadcast the anniversary as a day of vengeance, urging soldiers to repay every atrocity, every burned village, every murdered civilian. The Red Army advanced with a sense of destiny, convinced that history itself was on their side. German defenders, in contrast, felt the crushing weight of inevitability. The anniversary that had once symbolized triumph now marked the beginning of their destruction. As the first day wore on, Soviet advances penetrated multiple sectors of the German line. Around Vitebsk, Orsha, and Bobruisk, breakthroughs widened as infantry and armor pressed relentlessly into the gaps. The depth of the Soviet attack stunned German commanders, who realized too late that they were not facing local assaults, but a coordinated offensive across hundreds of kilometers. Counterattacks were attempted in some sectors, but they collapsed under the weight of artillery and airstrikes. Reserves, already scarce, were thrown into the fray piecemeal, only to be annihilated in turn. The Wehrmacht's defensive system, built on the assumption of strong points and counterblows, crumbled when faced with the sheer depth and synchronization of the Soviet assault. By nightfall on June 22nd, entire divisions were reeling backward, their cohesion shattered. What had begun as artillery thunder in the morning became by evening a rolling disaster stretching across the central front. The opening blows of Operation Bagration revealed the maturity of the Red Army and the fragility of the Wehrmacht. In a single day, Soviet forces demonstrated mastery of combined arms warfare, artillery, air power, infantry, armor, and engineers working together with precision. German defences, weakened by Hitler's misjudgments and the blindness of OKH, were obliterated in hours. The anniversary of Barbarossa had come full circle, transforming from the day of Soviet humiliation into the day of German catastrophe. For the men of Army Group Center, it marked the beginning of a nightmare from which few would escape. For the Red Army, it was the triumphant unveiling of a juggernaut that could not be stopped. June 22, 1944, was not merely the start of a battle, it was the dawn of a campaign that would shatter Hitler's Eastern Front and alter the fate of Europe. In the northern sector of Operation Bagration, the thunder of artillery and the surge of Soviet divisions were directed at the fortified cities of Vitebsk and Orsha. These towns, heavily defended and vital to Army Group Center's northern flank, were linchpins in the German defensive network. Vitebsk, on the Dvina River, had been turned into a stronghold, ringed with bunkers and trenches to delay any advance. Orsha, positioned on the Moscow-Minsk highway, was equally critical, its fortifications designed to anchor the central line of resistance. The German Fourth Army, stretched thin, held these positions with worn divisions and dwindling supplies. Hitler had declared Vitebsk a Fester Platz, a fortress city to be held at all costs, forbidding any retreat. This decision condemned its defenders to a hopeless stand, trapping them in the jaws of the Soviet offensive. The Red Army, meanwhile, deployed overwhelming strength, intent on crushing these bastions in days rather than weeks. For both sides, the battles at Vitebsk and Orsha were to become symbolic of the larger struggle between rigidity and momentum. At Vitebsk, the Soviet First Baltic Front under General Ivan Bagration unleashed its forces with precision. Artillery barrages tore into German trenches, silencing bunkers that had been carefully prepared for years. Infantry surged forward, engineers clearing minefields, while tanks rolled behind them in dense formations. The defenders, already rattled by the bombardment, found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer weight of the assault. Communications collapsed as Soviet shells destroyed telephone lines, leaving commanders cut off from higher headquarters. Attempts to reorganize met with disaster as Soviet infantry poured through breaches faster than German reserves could respond. Within hours, the outer defenses began to crumble, and Soviet units pressed toward the river crossings. Hitler's order forbidding retreat turned a tactical withdrawal into a death trap, sealing the fate of the divisions inside. By nightfall, Soviet forces had begun encircling the city, leaving its defenders isolated and doomed. The encirclement of Vitebsk was executed with stunning speed. Soviet armored units bypassed strongpoints, driving deep to cut supply routes and close the ring around the city. Within 3 days, 4 German divisions were trapped, numbering nearly 30,000 men. The defenders fought fiercely, clinging to buildings, bridges, and riverbanks, but the odds were hopelessly stacked against them. Soviet artillery reduced entire neighborhoods to rubble, burying soldiers in the ruins of houses they had been ordered to defend. Counterattacks were launched in desperation, but they broke against the wall of Soviet firepower. Supplies dwindled rapidly, with ammunition and food running out under relentless pressure. German soldiers faced a stark choice: surrender, death, or futile resistance in a collapsing fortress. By June 27th, Soviet forces stormed the city in waves, reducing the pocket to silence. Of the defenders, only a handful managed to escape the inferno, while tens of thousands were killed or captured. Orsha, meanwhile, became the stage for one of the most intense clashes of the opening phase of Bagration. Defended by elements of the German Fourth Army, and reinforced with fortified lines, Orsha was regarded as a bastion capable of holding back Soviet armor. The Moscow-Minsk highway, a vital artery for German logistics, passed through the city, making it indispensable to the Wehrmacht's control of central Belorussia. The Soviets understood this significance and concentrated enormous firepower against it. Artillery and Katyusha rockets turned trenches and bunkers into smouldering wrecks, while airstrikes hammered supply depots and command posts. Infantry divisions pressed forward relentlessly, supported by IS-2 heavy tanks that shrugged off German anti-tank fire. German soldiers clung to their positions with grim determination, repelling wave after wave of attacks with machine guns and panzerfausts. But the Red Army's numerical superiority proved decisive, and each hour of resistance brought new Soviet troops into the fight. The city, once considered impregnable, began to buckle under the pressure of coordinated Soviet onslaughts. The Soviet Third Belarusian Front under General Ivan Chernyakhovsky spearheaded the assault on Orsha with remarkable coordination. Engineers cleared paths through minefields under fire, while armored columns bypassed resistance points to strike at the flanks. Infantry units advanced methodically, house by house, trench by trench, grinding down German defenders in bloody close combat. Soviet artillery shifted forward in rolling barrages, ensuring that German reinforcements were smashed before they could stabilize the line. Luftwaffe attempts to intervene were scattered by swarms of Soviet fighters, leaving ground forces exposed to relentless airstrikes. German morale began to crack as the realization set in that no relief would come. Hitler's obsession with holding every inch of ground had stripped reserves from Orsha, leaving it vulnerable to envelopment. By June 26th, Soviet breakthroughs on both flanks rendered the German position untenable. Chernyakhovsky's armies pressed into the heart of the defenses, tightening the noose around the city. Orsha was no longer a fortress but a trap for its defenders. The collapse of Orsha unfolded rapidly once Soviet forces penetrated its defensive perimeter. German strongpoints, once formidable, were reduced to isolated pockets cut off from one another. Soviet tanks drove through the city streets, crushing barricades and blasting defenders from buildings. Infantry cleared cellars and attics with grenades and flamethrowers, leaving no refuge for the cornered Wehrmacht. Command posts were overrun, with officers captured or killed in their headquarters. Attempts to mount counterattacks dissolved in chaos, as fragmented units lacked coordination or supplies. Soviet propaganda units broadcast surrender appeals, promising mercy to those who laid down arms. Some German soldiers capitulated, staggering out of ruins with hands raised, while others fought to the death, unwilling or unable to disobey Hitler's orders. By the end of June, Orsha was firmly in Soviet hands, its once proud defenses annihilated. The Moscow-Minsk highway lay open, a highway now leading to the heart of Army Group Center's collapse. The twin disasters at Vitebsk and Orsha marked the unraveling of the northern flank of Army Group Center. With tens of thousands of men lost, the German line disintegrated into a patchwork of shattered formations incapable of coordinated resistance. Supply depots, rail hubs, and communications lines fell into Soviet hands, further crippling the Wehrmacht's ability to respond. The Red Army now held a corridor through which armor could pour westward, bypassing surviving German positions and driving deeper into Belorussia. Hitler's orders to hold fortress cities had backfired catastrophically, transforming strategic strongpoints into death traps. Soviet deep battle theory had proven its worth, overwhelming strong defenses with synchronized blows of artillery, air power, armor, and infantry. German commanders on the ground pleaded for permission to withdraw, but their requests were ignored or denied. The fate of Vitebsk and Orsha became emblematic of the larger catastrophe engulfing Army Group Center. The northern front was no longer holding, it was collapsing entirely. The encirclement and destruction of Vitebsk and Orsha sent shockwaves through both armies. For the Germans, it was a brutal confirmation that their faith in fortress cities and rigid defense was a deadly illusion. For the Soviets, it was proof that their planning, deception, and overwhelming firepower could achieve results on a scale once unimaginable. The victories opened the door for deeper thrusts toward Minsk, setting the stage for the encirclement of entire German armies. The destruction of tens of thousands of German troops in just days weakened Army Group Center irreparably, leaving it unable to restore a coherent defense. Survivors who managed to flee westward carried with them stories of annihilation that spread panic among other German formations. Soviet soldiers, meanwhile, marched through smoldering ruins with a sense of triumph and vengeance, knowing they were reshaping the course of the war. The fall of Vitebsk and Orsha was not merely a tactical success, it was a strategic earthquake that announced the beginning of the end for the Wehrmacht in the east. As June 1944 advanced, the German Fourth Army, commanded by General Kurt von Tippelskirch, found itself positioned squarely in the path of the Soviet Juggernaut. The army had been tasked with holding a sector of the front stretching across Belorussia, guarding crucial approaches to Minsk. Its divisions, weakened by years of attrition and months of Soviet pressure, were scattered across fortified zones designed more for static defense than mobile war. Hitler's orders forbade retreat, declaring every strongpoint a fortress to be held to the last man, dooming flexibility. When the Soviet offensive erupted on June 22, the Fourth Army's units absorbed the brunt of coordinated assaults from multiple Soviet fronts. Artillery barrages shattered trenches, command posts, and supply lines in the opening hours, paralyzing the defenders. Communications disintegrated as telephone lines were shredded, radios jammed, and couriers lost amid the chaos. The German Fourth Army suddenly faced a Red Army that was not only larger but also better equipped, better supplied, and operating with astonishing speed. The fate of this once proud formation was being sealed almost before the battle began. The Soviet Second Belarusian Front under General Zakharov spearheaded the assault against the Fourth Army's positions, supported by the First Belarusian and Third Belarusian fronts on its flanks. This created a massive pincer, aiming not only to shatter the German line, but to encircle and annihilate it entirely. Soviet infantry stormed forward under the cover of devastating artillery, their movements closely coordinated with advancing tank brigades. Engineers rapidly bridged rivers and blasted through obstacles, ensuring momentum never faltered. The Luftwaffe, once a decisive force, could muster little more than token resistance against the waves of Soviet aircraft dominating the skies. Within days, Soviet breakthroughs were achieved at multiple points, creating deep wedges into the Fourth Army's defenses. Entire divisions were cut off from one another, unable to mount counterattacks or retreat to secondary lines. German attempts to regroup were undone by constant Soviet pressure and overwhelming numerical superiority. By June 25, the Soviet pincers were closing, and the Fourth Army's position grew ever more desperate. Inside the German lines, chaos and despair spread as units realized their predicament. Hitler's orders demanded that Vitebsk and other fortified towns be held at all costs, ensuring that tens of thousands of soldiers would be sacrificed rather than allowed to maneuver. Commanders who argued for tactical withdrawals were overruled or ignored, forced to hold positions that had already lost strategic relevance. Soldiers fought stubbornly, clinging to bunkers, trenches, and towns as Soviet artillery pulverized them. Morale plummeted as food and ammunition ran short, leaving men to fight with dwindling supplies under constant bombardment. Attempts to establish coherent defensive lines collapsed as Soviet tanks and mechanized infantry bypassed strongpoints, cutting units off from one another. Survivors retreated piecemeal into forests and villages, only to be surrounded again by rapidly advancing Soviet spearheads. Reports of annihilation in neighboring sectors, Vitebsk, Orsha, and Mogilev, spread panic among the ranks. The realization dawned that the Fourth Army was not simply being defeated, it was being annihilated. The encirclement was completed with ruthless precision as Soviet forces sealed the ring around the Fourth Army. Vast columns of armor and infantry surged westward, closing every road to Minsk and cutting off any hope of organized retreat. German attempts to break out were met with merciless artillery barrages and coordinated counterattacks by Soviet tank brigades. The landscape became a killing ground, with destroyed vehicles and shattered columns littering the roads. Survivors described forests echoing with the constant rumble of artillery and the cries of trapped men stumbling into ambushes. Luftwaffe pilots attempting desperate supply drops found themselves shot down in droves by Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Inside the pocket, German units were reduced to small scattered groups struggling to survive. Entire regiments were surrounded, their positions obliterated by concentrated Soviet firepower. What had once been an army was degenerating into isolated clusters of desperate men. The noose had tightened, and with each passing hour, escape became less possible. The battles inside the encirclement were ferocious, as German commanders attempted to rally their troops for last-ditch efforts. General Tippelskirch struggled to maintain order, directing scattered forces into coordinated breakouts. Yet every attempt ran headlong into prepared Soviet defenses, supported by artillery and tanks positioned precisely to crush such efforts. Soviet commanders understood the value of annihilating the pocket and ensured no escape corridor could remain open. The fighting devolved into brutal close combat in villages, forests, and marshes, with Soviet infantry clearing positions room by room. German soldiers, exhausted and starving, fought with grim desperation, often reduced to hand-to-hand struggles with bayonets and knives. Prisoners began surrendering in large numbers, entire battalions laying down their arms rather than be slaughtered. Soviet propaganda units encouraged capitulation, amplifying the psychological collapse of the defenders. By June 28th, the Fourth Army was no longer a coherent fighting force, but a shattered remnant awaiting destruction. The scale of the disaster became clear when Soviet commanders tallied the prisoners and the battlefield wreckage. More than 130,000 German soldiers were captured in the destruction of the Fourth Army, one of the greatest hauls of the entire Eastern Front. Thousands more lay dead across fields and forests, their bodies mingled with burned-out vehicles and shattered artillery. The Soviet advance was so overwhelming that the Fourth Army had no opportunity to preserve its heavy equipment, leaving behind vast arsenals for Soviet inspection. Prisoners marched eastward in endless columns, exhausted, wounded, and stunned by the scale of their defeat. The once proud Wehrmacht units had been reduced to ragged survivors, trudging under guard toward captivity. Soviet soldiers, hardened by years of suffering, viewed the annihilation as vengeance for atrocities committed in their homeland. German officers, who had once believed in Hitler's promises of victory, now saw their careers and armies destroyed in days. The fall of the Fourth Army was a humiliation that reverberated throughout the Wehrmacht. For the Red Army, the destruction of the Fourth Army was more than just a battlefield victory. It was a demonstration of strategic mastery. Operation Bagration had achieved what German commanders once thought impossible. the complete annihilation of an entire army group's core formation. The Soviet doctrine of deep operations, executed with coordination and relentless pressure, had proven devastatingly effective. The collapse of the Fourth Army opened the road to Minsk and set the stage for further encirclements deeper in Belorussia. Soviet soldiers advanced through wreckage, liberated villages, and abandoned German fortifications with a sense of unstoppable momentum. Morale surged as word spread of the enormous victory, reinforcing belief in ultimate triumph over the Reich. For Stalin, it was proof that the Red Army was not only reclaiming lost territory, but also striking fatal blows to Hitler's military machine. German prisoners, once considered the backbone of the Wehrmacht, were now paraded eastward as symbols of Soviet dominance. The destruction of the Fourth Army became a cornerstone of the legend of Operation Bagration. In the broader context of the war, the annihilation of the German Fourth Army was one of the worst defeats in Wehrmacht history. It rivaled Stalingrad in scale and surpassed it in speed, a catastrophe that stripped Army Group Center of its core strength. The loss of men, equipment, and morale could never be replaced, especially as the Western Allies pressed from Normandy at the same time. Hitler, enraged by the disaster, blamed his generals while refusing to accept responsibility for his rigid orders that had sealed their fate. For the Soviets, it was the clearest sign yet that the Wehrmacht was not invincible, that the tide of war had irrevocably shifted. Entire regions of Belorussia now lay open to Soviet liberation, with Minsk itself poised to fall within days. The Red Army had demonstrated not only its strength, but also its ability to coordinate colossal offensives on a scale unmatched in history. The destruction of the Fourth Army was a symbol of Germany's strategic collapse, a blow from which it would never recover. Its memory endures as one of the decisive moments of World War II's Eastern Front. With the destruction of the German Fourth Army, the Soviet advance gathered unstoppable momentum, surging westward toward Minsk, the capital of Belorussia. Soviet armor, freed from the constraints of fighting fortified positions, now raced across open countryside in sweeping movements. Tank columns, supported by mechanized infantry and artillery, rolled day and night, exploiting every breach in the German line. Villages that had once formed defensive outposts were bypassed or overrun in minutes, their garrisons scattered. The Red Army's operational tempo stunned surviving German units, who could neither regroup nor mount coherent defenses. Supply trucks thundered along newly secured routes, keeping fuel and ammunition flowing to the front. Air superiority ensured that any German attempt at reinforcement or counterattack was annihilated by Soviet bombers and fighters. Roads west of Vitebsk and Orsha became clogged with German stragglers and shattered remnants of divisions, easy prey for advancing Soviet spearheads. By late June 1944, the Soviet Juggernaut was no longer merely pressing, it was racing toward a decisive encirclement at Minsk. The German High Command, paralyzed by conflicting orders and Hitler's refusal to sanction withdrawals, could not form a coherent plan to stop the advance. Field commanders in Army Group Center begged for permission to retreat and regroup, pointing to the catastrophic losses already suffered. Yet Hitler, still clinging to his doctrine of holding ground at all costs, insisted on defending every town as a fortress. This rigidity condemned countless units to destruction, as Soviet breakthroughs simply bypassed these strongpoints. In Berlin, the Oberkommando des Heeres OKH misread the scale of the Soviet advance, underestimating the speed and coordination of the Red Army. General Busch, commander of Army Group Center, was dismissed on June 28 and replaced by Field Marshal Model, known as the Fireman for his ability to stabilize crises. yet even Model could not conjure fresh divisions or halt the rolling disaster that surrounded him. Command paralysis at the top meant German formations were abandoned to their fate, cut off before they even realized the scale of the danger. The road to Minsk lay open, and the Soviets were already closing in. Soviet strategy focused on encircling German forces east of Minsk, ensuring that not only the capital, but also the remnants of Army Group Center would be destroyed. The Red Army's 1st Belarusian Front under Rokossovsky and 3rd Belarusian Front under Chernyakhovsky advanced on parallel axes, forming massive pincers. South of Minsk, Rokossovsky's armored units surged toward Bobrysik and then turned north, sweeping across the Berezina River. To the north, Chernyakhovsky's tanks bypassed scattered German defenses, driving westward with relentless speed. These converging thrusts aimed to trap the bulk of German forces in a vast pocket east of Minsk. Soviet deep battle doctrine was being executed with textbook precision, exploiting disarray and preventing the enemy from regaining equilibrium. Coordination between fronts ensured that breakthroughs were not isolated, but linked into a larger strategic net. The goal was clear: to close the encirclement and obliterate the last semblance of organized German resistance in Belorussia. For the Red Army, Minsk was not only a city, it was the killing ground of an entire enemy army group. German soldiers retreating toward Minsk found themselves in an increasingly nightmarish landscape. Roads were choked with broken columns of trucks, horse-drawn wagons, and exhausted infantry stumbling westward. Soviet aircraft strafed these convoys relentlessly, turning withdrawal routes into killing fields. Villages became scenes of chaos as retreating Germans clashed with Soviet vanguards, often fighting desperate rearguard actions before being overrun. Entire units melted away, their survivors fleeing through forests and swamps, hunted by advancing Soviet patrols. Communications collapsed further, with radio silence in many sectors as headquarters were destroyed or captured. Field officers struggled to gather their men, issuing contradictory orders as the situation disintegrated by the hour. Rumors of annihilation at Vitebsk and Orsha spread like wildfire, deepening panic among the ranks. Soldiers no longer spoke of holding lines or stabilizing defenses, only of survival and escape. The retreat to Minsk became less an organized withdrawal and more a route, shadowed by the inevitability of encirclement. For Soviet troops, the advance to Minsk represented both a triumph of military skill and a campaign of vengeance. Tank brigades pressed forward with astonishing momentum, often outrunning their own infantry in pursuit of retreating Germans. Bridges were seized intact or rebuilt overnight by swarms of engineers, ensuring that the offensive never lost pace. Soviet pilots circled overhead, providing reconnaissance and destroying enemy concentrations before they could solidify. Captured towns revealed scenes of devastation, with burned villages, mass graves, and atrocities committed by retreating SS units, fueling the Red Army's fury. Civilians often greeted the advancing Soviets with tears and gifts of bread, though many were too traumatized to celebrate openly. Every mile advance carried symbolic weight, erasing years of German occupation and reclaiming lost territory. Morale in the Soviet ranks soared as reports circulated of entire German armies collapsing before their eyes. Officers exhorted their troops to press harder, reminding them that every step brought them closer to ultimate victory over fascism. The road to Minsk was not only a military operation, it was a march of liberation. The Berezina River became the next great obstacle in the German retreat, and the Soviet pursuit. For the Germans, crossing the river was essential to forming a defensive line that might slow the Red Army. Bridges became choke points, with thousands of men and vehicles crammed together under constant Soviet air attack. Bombs and artillery shells turned crossings into scenes of unimaginable carnage, with burning trucks and drowning soldiers clogging the waters. Soviet artillery zeroed in on ferries and pontoon bridges, destroying them before they could be completed. German engineers worked frantically, often under fire, but the sheer pressure of retreat made their efforts futile. Meanwhile, Soviet armored spearheads found alternative crossings, storming across shallow fords or using hastily built bridges to maintain momentum. The Berezina, once a natural barrier, instead became a trap as the Germans lost time and lives attempting to hold it. Soviet forces, crossing with speed and coordination, widened the encirclement and pressed closer to Minsk. The German dream of a stabilized line evaporated on the banks of the Berezina. By the first days of July, Soviet pincers were converging around Minsk with devastating inevitability. Chernyakhovsky's Third Belarusian Front advanced from the north, while Rokossovsky's First Belarusian Front swept up from the south. German forces, fragmented and exhausted, were being squeezed into an ever-narrowing corridor east of the city. Efforts to establish a defensive perimeter around Minsk were hampered by a lack of men, equipment, and coherent command. The Ninth Army, already mauled at Bobruisk, staggered westward into the tightening Soviet trap. Hitler's orders to hold Minsk as a fortress city were meaningless, as there were scarcely enough troops left to defend it. Soviet armor pressed relentlessly, bypassing resistance and striking deep into the German rear. Partisan units joined the offensive, sabotaging rail lines and ambushing convoys, further disorienting retreating troops. The encirclement was nearly complete, and the city of Minsk was about to become the tomb of yet another German army. What began as a retreat was transforming into a catastrophe of annihilation. The road to Minsk was thus paved with both triumph and tragedy, a corridor of destruction stretching across Belorussia. For the Germans, it was the collapse of an entire army group, a disaster from which their eastern front would never recover. For the Soviets, it was the culmination of years of preparation, sacrifice, and doctrinal refinement, proving their mastery of modern warfare. The Red Army had not only shattered German defenses, but also demonstrated an ability to exploit victory on an operational scale. Civilians in liberated towns bore witness to both the horrors of occupation and the sudden arrival of freedom. Soviet commanders, pressing their troops forward, knew that Minsk was the key to the destruction of Army Group Center. Each mile brought them closer to closing the trap, to capturing tens of thousands of enemy soldiers, and to driving the Germans from Belorussia forever. The fate of the Eastern Front hung in the balance as the pincers closed. The city of Minsk loomed ahead, a target, a prize, and a graveyard. By early July 1944, the Soviet pincers around Minsk snapped shut with iron precision, encircling what remained of the German Fourth Army, the shattered Ninth Army, and parts of other retreating formations. Tens of thousands of German soldiers, already battered by weeks of combat, now found themselves trapped in a tightening noose east of the city. The Red Army had executed one of the largest encirclements in history, cutting off every road, bridge, and path of escape. Soviet tank brigades roared westward to seal the ring, while infantry dug in along the perimeter to block desperate breakout attempts. The Minsk pocket stretched across forests, swamps, and villages, but geography offered no salvation to the encircled. German command structures had disintegrated, with officers unable to issue coherent orders as communications collapsed entirely. Hitler's directive to hold Minsk as a fortress was meaningless, for the garrison lacked the strength even to man its defenses. The trapped divisions, numbering close to 100,000 men, were exhausted, disorganized, and hemmed in by overwhelming Soviet firepower. The pocket had become a massive killing ground, and its destruction was only a matter of time. Inside the Minsk pocket, chaos reigned as German units struggled to comprehend their situation. Soldiers moved in ragged columns through forests and fields, hoping to find a gap in the Soviet lines. Exhausted men collapsed by the roadside, while horses died in their traces, blocking retreat routes with carcasses. Food and ammunition were almost gone, leaving troops to forage or fight with dwindling supplies. Rumors spread wildly, some insisting that relief forces would arrive, others whispering of inevitable annihilation. Officers attempted to rally their men, but the lack of coordination turned every order into confusion. Some units attempted organized breakouts, while others dissolved into bands of fugitives, guided only by the instinct to survive. Soviet artillery hammered concentrations of troops, scattering them before they could assemble for counterattacks. Villages became charnel houses, filled with wounded soldiers and civilians caught in the maelstrom. Within days, the pocket's internal cohesion collapsed, leaving only desperation in its place. The Soviet High Command, fully aware of the scale of the encirclement, pressed relentlessly to crush the trapped armies. Artillery units ringed the pocket, saturating it with bombardments that made movement almost impossible. Aircraft strafed retreating German columns, turning roads into fiery death traps littered with wreckage and bodies. Tank brigades pushed inward, slicing the encirclement into smaller fragments, isolating divisions from one another. Soviet infantry advanced methodically, capturing villages and crossroads, sweeping aside pockets of resistance with grenades and machine guns. Every day the circle grew smaller, squeezing thousands of men into shrinking patches of forest and farmland. Soviet commanders demanded surrender, but many Germans clung to Hitler's orders and fought hopeless battles against overwhelming odds. The Red Army, determined to prevent any escape, pursued fugitives into the swamps and woods with relentless vigor. Prisoners were taken in droves, their numbers swelling so rapidly that Soviet guards could barely keep pace. The destruction of the Minsk pocket was unfolding with ruthless efficiency. German attempts to break out of the pocket turned into slaughter. Groups of soldiers, sometimes numbering thousands, massed for desperate charges against Soviet lines. They hurled themselves at Soviet positions, only to be shattered by artillery and machine gun fire. Survivors staggered back, leaving fields strewn with the dead and wounded. Some tried to slip through at night, guided by moonlight and sheer desperation, but Soviet patrols hunted them down. Rivers that offered possible escape became killing zones, with Soviet fire sweeping across bridges and fords. Whole battalions drowned in chaotic crossings, their bodies carried downstream. The Soviet encirclement was too tight, too well planned, to allow even a fragment of organized withdrawal. By July 6th, repeated breakout attempts had bled the Germans white, leaving only shattered remnants of once proud divisions. The pocket was now a graveyard, its men dying not in pitched battles, but in futile struggles for survival. The surrender of German forces began piecemeal, as starving, exhausted soldiers realized resistance was futile. Entire regiments laid down their arms, raising makeshift white flags fashioned from shirts and bandages. Columns of prisoners trudged eastward under Soviet guard, their faces hollow from hunger and shock. Many were wounded, hobbling on improvised crutches or carried by their comrades. Soviet soldiers watched with grim satisfaction, remembering the atrocities committed by Germans in occupied villages. Some prisoners were beaten or executed on the spot, victims of vengeance for years of suffering. Others were marched into captivity, their fate sealed in Soviet prison camps far from home. Commanders who had once barked orders now shuffled among their men, powerless and broken. The sheer scale of the capitulation overwhelmed Soviet logistics, as tens of thousands of captives poured into collection points. What had once been the backbone of Army Group Center was reduced to disarmed, dispirited columns of defeated men. Minsk itself fell swiftly as Soviet troops stormed into the city on July 3, 1944, greeted by civilians who had endured 3 years of brutal occupation. The German garrison, too small and disorganized to mount a defense, was swept aside in hours. Soviet tanks rumbled through the streets, greeted by crowds offering bread, flowers, and tears of joy. The liberation revealed scenes of devastation, with bombed-out buildings, mass graves, and signs of atrocities committed during the occupation. For the Red Army, the fall of Minsk symbolized not only military triumph, but also moral vindication. Civilians emerged from hiding to welcome their liberators, though the scars of occupation would linger for generations. German stragglers captured in the city were marched through the streets, living symbols of the Reich's defeat. Soviet commanders declared the liberation of Minsk a decisive milestone in the campaign. Behind the celebration, however, the battle to destroy the pocket still raged outside the city. The final collapse of the encircled armies was imminent. By July 8th, the Minsk pocket had ceased to exist. The last organized German resistance was annihilated in forests east of the city, where Soviet forces closed in from all sides. Tens of thousands of prisoners were captured in the final days, bringing the total to over 100,000 men taken during Operation Bagration's opening phase. The pocket became a vast wasteland of corpses, burned-out vehicles, and shattered equipment. German survivors spoke of chaos so complete that no unit structure remained, only desperate groups of men stumbling blindly towards Soviet lines. Soviet soldiers combed the battlefield, collecting weapons, vehicles, and prisoners, astonished by the scale of the collapse. The destruction of the Minsk pocket marked the effective end of Army Group Center as a fighting force. Its annihilation echoed across the Eastern Front, a disaster unparalleled since Stalingrad. The road westward into Poland now lay open, and the Red Army pressed forward with renewed determination. The Wehrmacht had suffered a blow from which it could never recover. The annihilation of German forces at Minsk was both a military and psychological catastrophe for the Reich. Entire divisions vanished from the order of battle, leaving gaps that could not be filled. Survivors who escaped carried with them stories of despair, starvation, and destruction that shattered morale across the front. Hitler raged at his generals, blaming them for cowardice while refusing to acknowledge his own disastrous orders. In Moscow, Stalin declared the liberation of Minsk a triumph of Soviet arms, celebrating it as proof of the Red Army's superiority. The victory was paraded through the streets, reinforcing the narrative that fascism was crumbling before Soviet power. For the people of Belorussia, it was liberation after years of darkness, though the scars of occupation remained etched into their lives. The destruction of the Minsk pocket also signaled to the Allies that Germany's collapse was accelerating. Operation Bagration had achieved far more than anticipated, breaking the back of German defenses in the east. The road to Berlin had begun to open, paved by the ruins of the Minsk pocket. The destruction of the Minsk pocket did not mark the end of Operation Bagration, but rather the opening act in the collapse of Germany's Army Group Center. This once mighty formation, entrusted with defending the heart of Belorussia, had been the anchor of Hitler's Eastern strategy since 1941. Now its divisions lay in ruins, its headquarters disoriented, and its survivors staggering westward in disorganized streams. Soviet spearheads drove relentlessly forward, bypassing resistance and cutting off retreating units before they could regroup. Villages that had been transformed into strongpoints became nothing more than stepping stones in the Red Army's advance. Railways and highways fell into Soviet hands with alarming speed, leaving German forces bereft of supply and mobility. Entire sections of the front dissolved as battalion after battalion surrendered or disintegrated under artillery and air assault. Commanders, stripped of communication, could no longer exert authority over their men, who fled in small, desperate bands. The central pillar of Hitler's eastern defense was crumbling, and the reality of catastrophe was undeniable. In Berlin, however, Hitler remained deluded, issuing furious orders from his Wolf's Lair headquarters, demanding that every inch of ground be held. He clung to the fantasy of fortress cities and iron willpower overcoming Soviet superiority. Field marshals and generals who dared to suggest tactical withdrawals were met with accusations of cowardice or betrayal. Entire corps were ordered to fight to the last man, even as they were already being overrun. Hitler's directives bore no relation to the battlefield, where Soviet armies swept forward with overwhelming force. Reinforcements promised by Berlin never materialized, as the Reich had no reserves left to commit. Meanwhile, the Wehrmacht logistical system was in collapse, its fuel trains and supply depots captured or destroyed. Hitler's fury became a substitute for strategy, lashing out at subordinates rather than confronting reality. His insistence on rigid defense turned defeats into disasters, ensuring annihilation rather than orderly withdrawal. As Army Group Center collapsed, it became clear that Hitler himself was its greatest liability. On the battlefield, the disintegration of German defenses reached staggering proportions. Divisions that had entered the summer campaign with thousands of men were reduced to mere skeleton units, with survivors scattered and incapable of coherent resistance. Columns of retreating troops clogged the countryside, vulnerable to Soviet tanks and aircraft. Red Army mechanized corps slashed across the rear, severing communications and isolating entire German formations. The once proud Wehrmacht, famed for its organization and discipline, now resembled a fleeing mob. Prisoners were taken in such numbers that Soviet commanders struggled to house and feed them. Forests and swamps became littered with abandoned equipment, burning vehicles, and the bodies of fallen soldiers. Survivors described the retreat as a nightmare of chaos, hunger, and constant fear of encirclement. The German army's reputation for invincibility on the Eastern Front was shattered in a matter of weeks. By mid-July, Army Group Center no longer existed as a coherent fighting force. What remained was only fragments, fleeing westward under constant pursuit. The scale of Soviet success astonished even the Stavka, the Soviet High Command. Operation Bagration had been planned as a decisive blow, but the results surpassed all expectations. In just over 2 weeks, the Red Army had advanced hundreds of kilometers, annihilated multiple German armies, and liberated vast swathes of Belorussia. Entire Wehrmacht formations had vanished from the order of battle, leaving Hitler's generals scrambling to fill gaping holes. The Soviets executed their deep battle doctrine flawlessly, striking simultaneously at multiple points, overwhelming defenses, and then flooding through the breaches with mechanized units. Air power ensured that German retreats turned into routs, while partisans in the rear crippled transportation networks. For Stalin, the collapse of Army Group Center was proof of the Red Army's ascendancy, vindicating years of sacrifice and industrial mobilization. Soviet morale soared as victories mounted, reinforcing belief in inevitable triumph. The collapse was not just a military defeat for Germany, but a seismic shift in the entire balance of the Eastern Front. For the German High Command, the catastrophe unfolded with numbing inevitability. Field Marshal Busch had been dismissed in late June for his inability to halt the Soviet advance, replaced by the more aggressive Field Marshal model. Known as the Fireman, Model had earned a reputation for stabilizing collapsing fronts, but in Belorussia, even his skills could not reverse the disaster. He arrived to find shattered divisions, non-existent reserves, and no coherent supply system. His orders to regroup and counterattack were ignored by exhausted commanders who no longer had the men or weapons to comply. Hitler demanded miracles, but Model had only fragments of armies left to command. He frantically tried to form new defensive lines along rivers and ridges, but Soviet breakthroughs rendered them irrelevant within days. Even as he fought to preserve what remained, Model privately acknowledged the campaign was lost. The disintegration of Army Group Center was beyond salvaging. The human cost of the collapse was immense. Estimates suggest that Army Group Center lost over 300,000 men during Operation Bagration, killed, wounded, or captured. These were not just numbers on a ledger, but the lifeblood of Germany's eastern armies, irreplaceable in the face of dwindling manpower. Prisoners marched eastward in endless columns, stunned by the swiftness of their defeat. Survivors spoke of comrades abandoned in forests, of officers lost without trace, of entire regiments erased in days. Civilians in Belorussia bore their own suffering, caught between retreating Germans and advancing Soviets. Villages were burned, populations displaced, and countless innocents slaughtered in the chaos. For the Red Army, the destruction of Army Group Center was vengeance for 3 years of brutal occupation. For the Germans, it was a nightmare of annihilation, eroding any hope of halting the Soviet tide. The collapse was not merely military, it was human tragedy on a colossal scale. The fall of Army Group Center also had far-reaching strategic consequences. With Belorussia liberated, the Soviet front lines surged hundreds of kilometers closer to Poland and the borders of Germany itself. The road to Warsaw and East Prussia lay open, threatening the very heart of the Reich. Hitler's insistence on defending every inch had drained manpower and material, leaving other sectors dangerously exposed. Army Group North in the Baltic and Army Group North Ukraine now faced the possibility of encirclement themselves. The German Eastern Front, once a formidable wall stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, was fractured and brittle. Operation Bagration had transformed the strategic map in a matter of weeks, shifting the balance irreversibly in favor of the Soviets. The Wehrmacht could no longer dictate the pace of war, it could only react to disasters. For the Allies both east and west, Germany's collapse signaled the beginning of the end. The Reich was bleeding out, and the world could see it. By the end of July 1944, the collapse of Army Group Center stood as one of the greatest disasters in German military history, rivaled only by Stalingrad. It was a defeat so total that it stunned contemporaries on both sides of the war. In Berlin, Hitler refused to acknowledge its true scale, still ranting about betrayal and weakness rather than strategy and reality. In Moscow, Stalin celebrated with parades and proclamations, declaring the destruction of Germany's eastern armies as proof of Soviet destiny. The Red Army pressed forward with confidence, knowing that the momentum was now irreversible. For the soldiers who fought through Belorussia, the ruins, corpses, and liberated towns testified to both triumph and horror. Operation Bagration had rewritten the course of the war in the east, breaking the Wehrmacht's back and exposing Germany to invasion. The collapse of Army Group Center was not just a chapter of defeat, it was the unraveling of Hitler's empire. From this moment on, the Reich was doomed, its downfall only a matter of time. With the collapse of Army Group Center, the Soviet offensive no longer faced coherent resistance and momentum surged forward with breathtaking speed. The Red Army, guided by the principles of deep battle, pressed beyond Minsk, with tank and mechanized corps leading the charge. Infantry divisions followed close behind, consolidating gains and clearing bypassed pockets of German resistance. Engineers built bridges across rivers in record time, while supply columns thundered westward to keep the spearheads fueled. Soviet aircraft roamed the skies almost unopposed, striking at retreating German columns and disrupting any attempt to regroup. Villages once scarred by German occupation saw Soviet soldiers arrive in waves, liberating civilians who had endured years of oppression. The operational depth of the advance astonished even Soviet commanders, as maps changed daily to reflect new gains. German strongpoints, once considered vital, were bypassed, surrounded, and reduced with minimal delay. By early July, the Soviet surge was rolling across Belorussia at a pace unseen since the beginning of the war. The offensive had become a tidal wave, sweeping everything before it. The liberation of Belorussia unfolded as both a military triumph and a human drama. Soviet forces entering towns and villages discovered the devastation left by years of German occupation. Entire communities had been razed, with mass graves testifying to the brutality of Nazi rule. Survivors emerged from forests and cellars, gaunt and hollow-eyed, some barely able to comprehend their freedom. For many civilians, the arrival of Soviet troops marked the end of forced labor, starvation, and constant terror. Soldiers shared rations with liberated populations, often greeted with tears and embraces. At the same time, the Red Army pressed onward without pause, mindful that pursuit of the retreating enemy was paramount. Civilians lined roads to watch endless columns of tanks and artillery rolling westward, their liberation mingling with the thunder of war still raging just ahead. The liberation of Belorussia became not only a victory of arms, but also a symbolic reclamation of Soviet soil. Each town freed marked another nail in the coffin of German domination. Strategically, the Soviets now sought to exploit their success by pushing beyond Belorussia into Poland and the Baltic states. The collapse of German defenses left gaps that were too wide to be filled, and Soviet spearheads surged into them like water through broken dams. Entire German formations fleeing westward were overtaken by Soviet armor and annihilated in running battles. Partisan units played a vital role, cutting rail lines and ambushing stragglers, further accelerating the Wehrmacht's collapse. Stalin urged his commanders to maintain pressure, insisting that there could be no pause while the enemy reeled. Stavka coordinated multiple fronts, ensuring that breakthroughs were widened and exploitation was relentless. The offensive transformed into a rolling storm that shifted the front line hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks. German efforts to establish defensive positions along rivers or ridges were simply brushed aside. For the Soviets, momentum itself became a weapon breaking not only German defenses, but also German morale. Belorussia was no longer contested, it was liberated in its entirety. The speed of the advance, however, posed immense logistical challenges for the Red Army. Supply lines stretched thin as tanks consumed vast quantities of fuel and ammunition at a staggering rate. Railways, destroyed by retreating Germans, had to be repaired by Soviet rail brigades working around the clock. Trucks churned through muddy roads, delivering essential supplies to forward units, often under the threat of German air raids or ambushes. Despite these difficulties, the Soviet logistical system proved astonishingly resilient, a testament to years of experience gained since 1941. Soviet commanders encouraged local populations to assist, with civilians helping repair bridges and provide food where possible. Improvised solutions kept the momentum alive, ensuring that spearheads did not run dry. German hopes that logistics would slow the Red Army were crushed, as new supply hubs were established within days of capturing cities. The Soviet war machine, though strained, never lost its rhythm. The offensive remained fluid, proving that the Red Army could sustain deep operations on an unprecedented scale. For the Germans, the Soviet momentum was catastrophic. unraveling what little cohesion remained. Hitler demanded that Army Group North and Army Group North Ukraine stabilize the front, but both were too weak and stretched to intervene effectively. Reinforcements were rushed from the west, but these divisions were under strength and ill-prepared for the ferocity of Soviet assaults. German soldiers who had once marched confidently into Russia now retreated in ragged groups, hounded by artillery and tanks. Defensive positions hastily thrown up along rivers like the Niemen were swept aside with brutal efficiency. The German command was forced into constant crisis management, moving units from one collapsing sector to another. Orders from Berlin grew increasingly detached from reality, demanding counterattacks that were impossible to execute. Morale plummeted as survivors realized that the Eastern Front was slipping away in giant fragments. The Wehrmacht's aura of invincibility had been shattered, replaced by the grim reality of ceaseless retreat. The Soviets were no longer just advancing, they were chasing Germany into its own backyard. For Soviet soldiers, the campaign across Belorussia carried immense emotional weight. Many had been born in the very villages they were now liberating, returning to landscapes scarred by occupation. Stories of atrocities committed by German forces fueled their determination to drive the invaders out completely. Soldiers marched through familiar towns, reduced to ashes, encountering neighbors and relatives who had endured the occupation. Liberation was often bittersweet, as joy mingled with grief at the destruction and loss. Yet the sense of purpose was unmistakable. This was not merely conquest, but homecoming. Red Army troops carried forward the conviction that they were avenging their families and restoring dignity to their homeland. Commanders recognized this morale boost and used it to drive their men harder in pursuit of retreating Germans. The offensive became not only a military mission, but a deeply personal crusade for millions of Soviet soldiers. Each liberated town carried stories of tragedy, but also of resilience and survival. The liberation of Belorussia also revealed the depth of partisan activity that had simmered under German occupation. Thousands of partisans emerged from forests, joining Soviet units as guides and fighters. They pointed out hidden German supply dumps, ambush sites, and weak points in defensive lines. Soviet commanders integrated these local fighters into their operations, blending irregular and conventional warfare seamlessly. Partisan sabotage of railways and bridges had already crippled German logistics, making retreats even more chaotic. Civilians who had sheltered partisans now openly celebrated their role in the liberation. The synergy between partisans and the advancing Red Army magnified the offensive speed and effectiveness. German attempts to suppress the partisans had failed disastrously, leaving them vulnerable when the Soviet tide arrived. The role of irregular fighters in Operation Bagration underscored how deeply the occupation had backfired, uniting entire populations against the Reich. Belorussia's liberation was as much the work of its people as of the Soviet armies. By the end of July 1944, the Red Army stood on the borders of Poland and the Baltic states, having surged hundreds of miles in less than 2 months. Belorussia was fully liberated, its capital reclaimed, and its population freed from 3 years of occupation. Operation Bagration had exceeded even the boldest expectations, annihilating Army Group Center and rewriting the balance of power on the Eastern Front. Soviet troops had not only reclaimed lost ground, but also opened the road to Warsaw, Vilnius, and beyond. German defenses were in tatters, incapable of halting the Soviet Juggernaut. Stalin hailed the victories as a turning point, parading them as evidence of Soviet destiny and resilience. For the world, the liberation of Belorussia stood as one of the greatest triumphs of World War II. The Red Army had unleashed momentum so overwhelming that the German Reich could no longer hope to contain it. The tide of history had shifted irrevocably, and the road to Berlin had begun. Long before Operation Bagration thundered across Belorussia, Soviet partisans had been fighting a hidden war in the forests, swamps, and villages of occupied territory. Numbering in the hundreds of thousands by 1944, these irregular fighters included former Red Army soldiers, escaped prisoners of war, and local civilians determined to resist the occupiers. Their battlefield was not open fields or fortified cities, but the lifelines that sustained the German war machine: railways, bridges, supply depots, and communication lines. By striking where the Wehrmacht was most vulnerable, partisans became a constant thorn in the side of German logistics. They used sabotage as their primary weapon, cutting rails at night, planting mines along highways, and ambushing convoys on forest roads. Though often under-equipped, their intimate knowledge of the terrain gave them a decisive edge. German attempts to eradicate partisan units only hardened their resolve and expanded their ranks. With every raid, they weakened the foundations of German control in Belorussia. By the time Bagration began, the partisans were already preparing the battlefield for the Red Army's advance. The most devastating weapon in the partisans' arsenal was the systematic sabotage of the railway network. German supply lines depended almost entirely on trains, which carried ammunition, reinforcements, and fuel from Poland and East Prussia deep into Belorussia. Partisan detachments specialized in derailing locomotives, destroying tracks, and blowing up bridges. They planted explosives under rails, timed to detonate beneath troop trains, sending carriages tumbling into ditches. Between February and June 1944, thousands of railway lines were cut in coordinated strikes, known collectively as rail wars. These operations forced the Germans to divert enormous manpower to guard railways, with entire security battalions tied down on rear area duties. Even so, the partisans always returned, striking the same sections of track night after night. The constant disruption slowed the movement of German reinforcements and starved frontline units of vital supplies. When the Red Army's offensive began, the Wehrmacht rail lifelines were already crippled beyond repair. The railway war was a silent but decisive front in Operation Bagration. Bridges became another prime target of partisan warfare, as they were essential choke points in German logistics. Whether spanning rivers, streams, or ravines, each bridge represented a vital artery for moving supplies and troops. Partisan demolition teams, often working under cover of night, planted explosives or burned wooden structures to the ground. These operations required immense courage, as German patrols guarded most crossings heavily, and discovery meant certain execution. Still, the partisans persisted, striking bridges faster than the Germans could repair them. The destruction of even a single bridge could delay supply columns for days, forcing the Wehrmacht to reroute convoys along primitive forest tracks. This disruption compounded the logistical strain already imposed by the Red Army's relentless pressure on the front. In some cases, partisans even coordinated directly with Soviet regular forces, timing the destruction of bridges to coincide with Red Army offensives. Every demolished bridge became both a tactical victory and a symbol of defiance. The Germans never controlled their supply lines as securely as they claimed. Ambushes formed another crucial element of partisan warfare. Forest roads and isolated highways were death traps for German convoys, which often traveled without adequate escort. Partisan fighters set mines beneath the dirt tracks, detonating them as trucks or armored cars passed overhead. Survivors of the explosions were then cut down in fusillades of gunfire before the partisans melted back into the woods. These attacks disrupted the delivery of supplies and created a pervasive sense of insecurity among German rear area troops. Soldiers tasked with escorting convoys lived in constant fear of ambush, their nerves frayed by the possibility of sudden death at every bend in the road. German reprisals were often brutal, with entire villages burned in retaliation, but such terror only drove more civilians to support the partisans. The forests of Belorussia became contested ground where every movement carried risk. For the Germans, it was a war without front lines, a battle against an invisible foe that drained morale and manpower. The coordination between partisan units and the Red Army was a decisive factor in Operation Bagration. Soviet High Command had long recognized the value of partisans as a strategic asset, and by 1944, lines of communication were firmly established. Radios allowed partisan groups to receive direct orders from Moscow, synchronizing their actions with the larger campaign. In the days leading up to Bagration, partisans launched massive waves of sabotage, cutting thousands of railway lines and destroying critical infrastructure. These strikes ensured that German reinforcements could not reach Army Group Center in time, isolating frontline units from their supply bases. During the offensive itself, partisans provided reconnaissance, guiding Red Army columns through forests and across rivers. They identified weak points in German defenses and reported on troop movements behind the front. This synergy between regular and irregular forces magnified the Red Army's effectiveness. It transformed partisan warfare from local resistance into a key pillar of Soviet strategy. German attempts to suppress the partisan movement were brutal and often counterproductive. Anti-partisan operations, known as Bandenbekämpfung, involved scorched earth tactics, mass shootings, and the destruction of entire villages suspected of aiding guerrillas. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed in these operations, with women, children, and the elderly often targeted indiscriminately. Far from eliminating resistance, these atrocities only deepened local hatred of the occupiers. Civilians who might have remained neutral were driven into the arms of the partisans, swelling their ranks. German commanders found themselves fighting a war of attrition in the forests, while the Red Army pressed on at the front. The dual pressure strained already exhausted resources, leaving the Wehrmacht incapable of controlling vast swaths of occupied territory. By 1944, German soldiers could no longer move safely beyond fortified towns and rail hubs. The countryside had become a partisan stronghold, a no-man's land where German authority existed only in theory. The human stories of the partisans added depth to their struggle. Many were ordinary villagers who had taken up arms after seeing family members executed or deported by the Germans. Some were teenagers, barely old enough to hold rifles, fighting alongside hardened Red Army veterans who had escaped encirclement. Women played a vital role, not only as couriers and medics, but also as fighters and leaders in their own right. The resilience of these groups reflected a collective will to resist, fueled by both ideology and personal vengeance. Living conditions were harsh, with fighters enduring freezing winters in makeshift shelters and surviving on meager rations. Illness and starvation were constant threats, yet the commitment to resistance never wavered. Songs, stories, and clandestine newspapers circulated among the groups, preserving morale and a sense of purpose. Each partisan unit became a microcosm of Soviet society at war, resilient, resourceful, and relentless. Their sacrifices shaped the battlefield in ways that statistics alone cannot capture. By the time the Red Army rolled into Belorussia in the summer of 1944, the partisans had already laid the groundwork for victory. Their sabotage campaigns crippled German logistics, ensuring that Army Group Center entered the decisive battles already weakened and disorganized. Their ambushes and raids drained manpower and sapped morale, forcing the Germans to fight a two-front war, one against the Red Army and another against the invisible armies of the forests. Their intelligence and reconnaissance provided the Soviets with critical advantages in planning and execution. Most importantly, their presence embodied the spirit of resistance, proving that the German occupation could never extinguish local defiance. Operation Bagration succeeded not only because of tanks, artillery, and air power, but because partisans had softened the battlefield long before the first Soviet barrage. In the story of the Eastern Front, the role of the partisans stands as a testament to the power of irregular warfare. Their fight was not glamorous, but it was decisive. As Operation Bagration opened on June 22, 1944, the skies above Belorussia became just as critical a battlefield as the rivers, forests, and cities below. The Red Air Force, once crippled by the disasters of 1941, now entered the campaign as a formidable and modernized force. Years of rebuilding had equipped it with thousands of fighters, bombers, and ground attack aircraft ready to unleash destruction on German lines. Air superiority was no longer a dream but a tangible reality, achieved through superior numbers and increasingly skilled pilots. Soviet air strategy was no longer defensive but aggressively offensive, designed to crush the Luftwaffe and dominate the battlefield. The Germans, by contrast, were entering a period of terminal decline. Their air arm was worn down by years of attrition in both East and West, with pilots scarce, fuel limited, and machines overstretched. This imbalance transformed Belorussia into a graveyard for the Luftwaffe. The air war would ensure that the Red Army's offensive rolled forward with unstoppable momentum. The Soviet aerial arsenal was vast and diverse, reflecting lessons learned through years of brutal conflict. Fighters like the Yak-9 and La-5FN patrolled the skies, engaging German interceptors in swirling dogfights. The rugged Il-2 Sturmovik, nicknamed the Flying Tank, was the spearhead of ground attack missions, strafing German columns with cannon fire and unleashing rockets on tanks and artillery. Medium bombers such as the P-2 delivered precision strikes against bridges, railways, and command posts, while long-range aircraft struck deeper into German-held territory. Coordination with ground forces had improved dramatically since 1941, thanks to radios and forward air controllers guiding squadrons onto targets. Soviet tactics emphasized saturation, overwhelming German defenses with wave after wave of aircraft. This combined arms approach integrated air and land forces into a single war machine. By the summer of 1944, the Red Air Force was not merely supporting the offensive, it was dictating its tempo. The skies became an extension of Soviet artillery barrages, pounding the enemy into submission. German air defenses struggled under this relentless assault. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was a shadow of its former self by 1944. On the Eastern Front, fighter groups were chronically understrength, with squadrons reduced to a fraction of their authorized numbers. Veteran pilots, the backbone of German air power, had been lost in battles stretching from Stalingrad to Normandy. Their replacements were often poorly trained, rushed through flight schools that could no longer afford the luxury of rigorous preparation. Shortages of aviation fuel compounded the crisis, grounding many units that still had serviceable aircraft. When Soviet formations appeared over the front, the Luftwaffe could rarely muster more than token resistance. German pilots who did engage found themselves outnumbered and outfought, often forced into desperate defensive maneuvers. The air war had become a battle of exhaustion, and the Luftwaffe was collapsing under the strain. The skies over Belorussia, once contested, now tilted decisively in Soviet favor. The Luftwaffe's decline had immediate and catastrophic consequences for the German army on the ground. Without air superiority, supply convoys were exposed to constant strafing attacks, their trucks torn apart by rockets and machine gun fire. German artillery positions were bombed with precision, silencing guns before they could blunt Soviet advances. Armored spearheads, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, were helpless under the glare of Il-2 squadrons circling overhead. Each column that attempted to maneuver by day was spotted, marked, and obliterated from the air. Bridges collapsed under bombing raids, severing escape routes for retreating units. The psychological impact was just as devastating as the physical destruction. Soldiers huddled in foxholes, listening to the drone of engines and dreading the next attack. Commanders struggled to coordinate defenses while communications lines were shredded by bombing raids. In Belorussia, the Luftwaffe's absence condemned the Wehrmacht to fight with one hand tied behind its back. For Soviet pilots, Operation Bagration became both a proving ground and a slaughterhouse. The vast scale of the offensive demanded constant sorties, with crews flying multiple missions a day over hostile territory. Dogfights erupted high above the forests, where Soviet fighters chased down the dwindling number of German interceptors. Sturmovik pilots flew low and deadly, braving anti-aircraft fire to deliver their payloads at point-blank range. The losses were heavy, as flak and machine gun nests extracted a grim toll, but the Red Air Force could absorb casualties in a way the Luftwaffe could not. Each pilot lost could be replaced, while each plane shot down was quickly rebuilt in Soviet factories. By contrast, every downed German ace represented an irreplaceable blow to Luftwaffe strength. Soviet aviators grew increasingly confident, their dominance reshaping the morale of both sides. The Red Army marched forward knowing the skies were theirs, while German infantry looked upward in terror at every distant hum of engines. Strategically, the Soviet mastery of the air transformed Operation Bagration into a coordinated blitzkrieg of the skies. Bombers softened up German defensive belts days before the main artillery barrages, ensuring that strongpoints were already weakened when Soviet troops advanced. Air reconnaissance provided real-time intelligence, identifying weak spots in the German line and tracking enemy reserves moving toward the front. When German columns attempted to regroup, they were attacked from above before reaching the battlefield. Soviet aircraft also played a key role in isolating encircled units, destroying bridges and roads to prevent breakout attempts. This fusion of intelligence, interdiction, and direct support created a seamless war machine. The Red Air Force had become not only a supporting actor, but a leading force in shaping the campaign. Its dominance deprived the Germans of the ability to maneuver strategically, reducing them to static, vulnerable targets. The skies themselves had become a weapon of annihilation. The Luftwaffe attempted countermeasures, but these efforts were too little, too late. Some fighter groups tried adopting hit-and-run tactics, swooping down on Soviet formations before retreating into the clouds. Others shifted to night operations, seeking to harass Soviet supply lines under the cover of darkness. Yet these measures had limited effect, as Soviet radar and night fighter squadrons grew increasingly adept at countering such moves. Anti-aircraft defenses were strengthened around key points, but the sheer scale of the Soviet assault overwhelmed them. Each flak battery silenced meant another open road for Soviet armor. German pilots flew with extraordinary bravery, often against impossible odds, but courage could not compensate for inferior numbers and declining resources. The Luftwaffe's impotence in Belorussia symbolized the larger collapse of German war-making capacity. It was not just a battle lost in the skies, but a sign that the Third Reich was fighting on borrowed time. By the conclusion of Operation Bagration, the air war over Belorussia had sealed the fate of Army Group Center. Soviet control of the skies ensured that German defenses crumbled under relentless bombardment, while retreating units were cut off and annihilated. The Luftwaffe had been bled white, its remaining aircraft scattered and ineffective. For the Red Army, the campaign proved that Soviet air power had matured into a decisive instrument of modern warfare. The balance of power in the air, once tilted in Germany's favor, had permanently shifted. The skies of Belorussia stood as a monument to this reversal, a domain where German might had been broken and Soviet strength reigned supreme. The Red Air Force had not only supported Bagration, but had accelerated its triumph, ensuring that German armies could not recover. In the great narrative of the Eastern Front, the battle for the air was as decisive as any fought on the ground. It was here, above the forests and rivers, that Germany's defeat was sealed. Operation Bagration, though celebrated as one of the greatest Soviet victories of the war, carried with it an unimaginable human toll that scarred Belorussia for generations. Entire regions were reduced to smouldering ruins as villages vanished beneath the thunder of artillery and bombing raids. Civilians, trapped between two colossal armies, bore the brunt of the destruction, their homes obliterated and livelihoods shattered. The German retreat was marked not by orderly withdrawal, but by savage scorched earth policies designed to deny the Red Army anything of use. Houses were torched, crops destroyed, and livestock slaughtered, leaving peasants with nothing but ashes. For many families, survival meant abandoning ancestral homes and fleeing into forests with only what they could carry. The speed and violence of the offensive left millions displaced, wandering through war-ravaged landscapes in search of shelter. Belorussia became not only a battlefield, but a graveyard of communities. Behind the sweeping arrows on Soviet maps lay lives shattered beyond repair. Civilian casualties during Operation Bagration numbered in the hundreds of thousands, a grim reminder that modern total war spared no one. Bombing raids, artillery fire, and tank battles cut down those unlucky enough to be caught in their path. Families often huddled in cellars or dugouts, praying the shells would pass overhead, only to emerge into ruins where their homes once stood. The German occupation had already devastated the population with famine and forced labor, and now the violence of liberation added new layers of suffering. Children became orphans overnight, while the elderly and sick perished from exhaustion during mass evacuations. Disease spread quickly in refugee camps, where overcrowding and lack of food created conditions ripe for typhus and dysentery. Even after Soviet troops passed through, countless civilians died of hunger or exposure, their villages too destroyed to sustain them. Each Soviet gain was measured not just in territory, but in lives sacrificed along the way. German reprisals against civilians intensified as the Wehrmacht's hold on Belorussia crumbled. Fearing collaboration with Soviet partisans, retreating units unleashed waves of terror upon the countryside. Entire villages suspected of aiding guerrillas were rounded up, their inhabitants shot, and their homes set ablaze. Men were hanged in public squares as warnings to others, while women and children were often driven into barns and burned alive. These massacres, though brutal, revealed the desperation of an occupying force aware its defeat was inevitable. The German retreat was marked by cruelty, not military honor, and left behind scars that no victory could erase. The scorched earth orders given by Hitler turned the withdrawal into an orgy of destruction. Bridges were blown up, factories dismantled, and even hospitals torched to ensure the Soviets inherited only rubble. In their rage, German forces waged war not only against armies, but against humanity itself. For the Red Army soldiers advancing westward, the human cost was not confined to civilians but deeply felt within their own ranks. Soviet casualties in Operation Bagration numbered in the hundreds of thousands, with infantrymen often paying the heaviest price during breakthroughs. Though artillery and air support softened German defenses, the final assaults fell upon soldiers who had to storm trenches, minefields, and fortified positions at close range. Entire battalions disappeared in a single day's fighting, swallowed by machine gun fire or buried under rubble from collapsing strongpoints. Medical facilities, overwhelmed by the scale of the carnage, treated wounded men in tents or open fields, where the cries of the dying mingled with the roar of battle. Survivors carried both physical and psychological wounds, scarred by the horrors they endured. Yet despite these sacrifices, Soviet morale remained high, driven by vengeance for years of occupation. Every loss was framed as a necessary price for victory. Among civilians, the suffering was compounded by forced deportations carried out by both Germans and Soviets. As the Wehrmacht retreated, thousands of men, women, and children were rounded up and marched toward Germany as slave laborers. Torn from their families, they faced grueling journeys to camps and factories where starvation and abuse awaited them. Meanwhile, Soviet security forces often treated liberated civilians with suspicion, accusing some of collaboration with the Germans. Families that had merely tried to survive under occupation now found themselves scrutinized, their loyalty questioned. This created a climate of fear, even in liberation, where freedom came with its own burdens. The war left civilians trapped between occupier and liberator, their choices reduced to survival at any cost. In the chaos of Bagration, ordinary people became pawns in a struggle that cared little for individual lives. The physical destruction of Belorussia was staggering, leaving cities and towns unrecognizable. Minsk, once a bustling capital, lay in ruins by the time Soviet troops retook it in July 1944. Streets were reduced to rubble-strewn wastelands, with shattered buildings rising like tombstones over the dead city. Factories, rail hubs, and schools had been obliterated, leaving the population without the infrastructure to rebuild. Villages across the countryside fared no better. Many wiped from maps entirely. Survivors spoke of walking for miles through charred ruins, where only chimneys remained to mark where homes once stood. Fields lay fallow, their crops destroyed in scorched earth retreats, ensuring famine for those who endured. Rebuilding Belorussia would take years, but the human memory of devastation would last far longer. Liberation had come at the price of near-total annihilation of both land and livelihood. Amidst this devastation, stories of individual suffering highlighted the human cost of the offensive. Eyewitnesses recalled children clinging to the corpses of parents killed during bombings, refusing to leave until soldiers carried them away. Old women described hiding in forests for weeks, living on berries and roots while their villages burned. Survivors of German massacres spoke of escaping mass graves, crawling through bodies to reach freedom. Each testimony revealed not just statistics but the raw humanity behind the war. For those who endured, Operation Bagration was not a tale of military triumph, but of unimaginable loss. The victory, however necessary, came drenched in blood. Soviet propaganda celebrated the offensive as a glorious march, but for the people on the ground it was survival through nightmare. The cost of breaking German power was measured not only in destroyed armies, but in the shattered lives of innocents. In the final reckoning, Operation Bagration was a triumph of strategy, but a tragedy of humanity. The annihilation of Army Group Center broke the back of German defenses in the east, but the campaign's legacy was inseparable from the suffering it caused. Cities were leveled, villages wiped out, and millions of civilians displaced in a single summer of war. The Red Army's sacrifice was immense, with tens of thousands buried in the soil they fought to reclaim. German atrocities added layers of horror, ensuring that liberation came with bitter memories. For Belorussia, the offensive was not only a turning point in the war, but a crucible of suffering that defined its wartime experience. The echoes of devastation would resonate for decades, in testimonies, ruins, and silent cemeteries scattered across the land. Victory came, but it was purchased at a price no generation could ever forget. Operation Bagration sent tremors through the German high command that rivaled the aftershocks of Stalingrad, delivering a devastating blow to Hitler's grand strategy. Army Group Center, once touted as the strongest bulwark of the Wehrmacht in the east, was annihilated in less than a month. Entire divisions vanished from the order of battle, their numbers reduced from tens of thousands to mere remnants. Hitler's belief that the Eastern Front could be held through sheer willpower was shattered by the scale of Soviet success. The map that once glowed with German advances now revealed gaping holes where armies had simply ceased to exist. For the Führer, who prided himself on infallibility, this catastrophe was not only military but personal. His refusal to allow retreats had condemned hundreds of thousands of soldiers to destruction. The Eastern Front, once envisioned as the foundation of German dominance, now became a bleeding wound draining the Reich of men and material. The shockwaves extended beyond the battlefield to the psychological heart of the Wehrmacht. German soldiers, already weary after years of grinding warfare, saw the destruction of Army Group Center as proof that the tide had permanently turned against them. Letters home spoke of despair, resignation, and an awareness that victory was no longer possible. Commanders, stripped of their forces, struggled to maintain discipline in the face of overwhelming Soviet momentum. Even veteran units, once the pride of the German army, found themselves retreating in chaos, their morale collapsing under the weight of continuous defeat. The image of German invincibility, carefully cultivated since 1939, was torn apart in the forests and fields of Belorussia. Each retreating soldier carried not only the burden of survival, but the knowledge that Germany's future was slipping away. The psychological collapse was as decisive as the physical destruction of divisions. In war, belief is half the battle, and belief had been broken. For Hitler, Operation Bagration deepened the paranoia and rigidity that already plagued his decision-making. Obsessed with the idea of holding every inch of territory, he responded to the disaster not with flexibility, but with renewed insistence on no-retreat orders. His fury toward generals who failed to stop the Soviet advance resulted in purges, dismissals, and executions. Commanders who had warned of vulnerabilities were vindicated but silenced, while sycophants continued to echo Hitler's delusions of eventual victory. This atmosphere of fear and distrust crippled the Wehrmacht's ability to adapt to the fluid situation on the ground. Instead of learning from the catastrophe, the German High Command repeated its mistakes, locking armies into untenable positions. The Führer's strategic vision narrowed to blind obstinacy, ensuring that future defeats would follow the same catastrophic pattern. Bagration was not merely a lost campaign, it was the moment when rational strategy collapsed under Hitler's dictatorship. The Soviet triumph fundamentally altered the balance of power on the Eastern Front. Before June 1944, the Germans still clung to hopes of stabilizing the front lines, believing they could regroup and counterattack. After Bagration, such illusions evaporated. The Red Army now stood on the borders of Poland, its spearhead surging hundreds of miles west in a matter of weeks. The destruction of Army Group Center left a yawning gap in the German defensive network, one that could not be filled by reserves already stretched thin across Europe. This strategic imbalance ensured that the Soviets would remain on the offensive for the rest of the war. German defensive lines were no longer bastions of strength, but temporary speed bumps, bought with blood. The war in the East ceased to be a contest of equals. It had become a relentless Soviet pursuit of a collapsing enemy. Bagration tipped the scale irreversibly. The disaster also reverberated through German society, shattering civilian morale on the home front. News of the destruction filtered back through whispered reports and casualty lists that grew longer with each passing day. Families who had already endured years of hardship now faced the loss of fathers, sons, and brothers on a scale that defied comprehension. Propaganda tried to disguise the catastrophe as a strategic withdrawal, but few were fooled by such euphemisms. As bodies failed to return and entire divisions were reported missing, the myth of German invincibility died in the hearts of ordinary citizens. Factories in the Reich churned out weapons at unprecedented rates, but each rifle produced seemed meaningless when armies disappeared overnight. The collapse in Belorussia planted seeds of doubt that no speech or poster could erase. For many it was the moment when victory ceased to be believable, and mere survival became the only hope. On the international stage, Operation Bagration reshaped Allied perceptions of Soviet power. Western leaders, already impressed by Soviet endurance at Stalingrad and Kursk, now saw the Red Army as an unstoppable juggernaut. The simultaneous Allied landings in Normandy and Soviet victories in Belorussia demonstrated a pincer movement that doomed Germany from both sides. Yet the sheer scale of the Soviet advance made clear that the Red Army would dominate Eastern Europe when the war ended. Stalin's forces had liberated Belorussia, but they were also on the doorstep of Poland, with Berlin suddenly within reach. For Churchill and Roosevelt, the implications were unmistakable. Soviet victories carried not only military weight, but political consequences. The strategic shockwaves of Bagration reached far beyond Germany, shaping the contours of post-war Europe even before the guns fell silent. It was both a triumph for the Allies and a harbinger of future tensions. The impact on the German military machine was catastrophic, extending far beyond the immediate losses of men and equipment. The destruction of Army Group Center erased entire stockpiles of artillery, tanks, and vehicles that could not be replaced. Fuel shortages became more acute, with supply lines severed and depots captured intact by Soviet forces. The Luftwaffe, already crippled, lost forward airfields and the ability to contest Soviet dominance in the skies. Communications networks collapsed, leaving surviving German units isolated and leaderless. Reinforcements rushed from the west, arrived too late and too weak to stem the tide. In essence, Bagration gutted the Wehrmacht's central nervous system, leaving its limbs flailing without coordination. The German army that emerged from the wreckage was no longer a professional force capable of offensive action. It was a battered shell fighting only for delay. The strategic consequences reached into every corner of the German war effort. In the end, the shockwaves of Operation Bagration were felt not only in the military defeat, but in the unraveling of Hitler's grand design for empire. The dream of a German-dominated East, with Belorussia as part of a vast colonial empire, lay in ruins beneath Soviet tanks. The collapse of Army Group Center signaled the death of the Reich's eastern ambitions and exposed Germany to the inevitability of invasion. What began as a carefully planned Soviet offensive had become a strategic earthquake that fractured Hitler's war effort beyond repair. The loss of men, machines, morale, and credibility could not be restored, no matter how fervently Berlin insisted otherwise. For Germany, Bagration was more than a battle lost. It was the turning point that sealed the fate of the Reich. The Eastern Front, once the foundation of Hitler's power, had become the stage for his downfall. From this moment onward, defeat was not only likely, it was certain. Operation Bagration did not unfold in isolation. It was part of a grand synchronized Allied effort to break the back of Nazi Germany on multiple fronts. While Soviet armies surged westward through Belorussia in June 1944, American, British, and Canadian forces had landed in Normandy just weeks earlier on June 6. For the first time in the war, the Allies coordinated offensives on a truly global scale, forcing Hitler's armies into a two-front struggle they could not possibly withstand. The timing was deliberate, a strategy agreed upon at the Tehran Conference, where Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin had pledged to launch simultaneous blows in the summer of 1944. As Soviet artillery rumbled across the east and Allied bombers darkened the skies over France, Germany's war machine found itself trapped between hammers striking from both sides. The synergy of these operations marked the beginning of the Reich's final collapse. Bagration was not merely a Soviet victory, it was a cornerstone of Allied strategy. The destruction of Army Group Center in Belorussia coincided with the desperate German defense in Normandy, creating an unprecedented strain on the Wehrmacht. Divisions that might have been rushed to France to repel the Allied landings were instead swallowed up in the cauldron of Bagration. Hitler's insistence on holding every inch of territory meant that his reserves were scattered thinly, unable to respond decisively to either crisis. In the west, panzer divisions faced Allied armor pushing inland from the beaches. In the east, the Red Army's tank armies surged toward Minsk and beyond, leaving the Germans no room to maneuver. For the first time since the war began, Germany was forced to fight two simultaneous decisive battles, both of which it was losing. The twin offensives of Normandy and Bagration represented the fulfillment of Allied strategy to stretch German power beyond its breaking point. Strategically, Bagration reshaped the global balance of power by ensuring that the Eastern Front would remain the decisive theatre of the war. While the Normandy invasion garnered headlines in the West, the scale of the Soviet advance dwarfed anything occurring in France. In a matter of weeks, the Red Army destroyed more German divisions than the Allies faced on D-Day. The collapse of Army Group Center meant that Germany could no longer hope to stabilize the Eastern Front. From this point forward, the Soviet advance became an unstoppable tide, rolling through Poland and toward the very heart of Germany. For the Allies, this created both relief and anxiety. Relief that the Soviets were absorbing and destroying the bulk of the Wehrmacht, and anxiety that Stalin's armies were rapidly approaching Central Europe. Bagration was not just a battlefield victory, it was a geopolitical earthquake, shifting the axis of the war firmly eastward. The coordination between Bagration and Normandy was not flawless, but its effects were devastating for Germany. The Western Allies had long demanded that Stalin launch a major offensive to draw German divisions away from France, and the Soviet leader delivered with crushing force. The Red Army's momentum ensured that Germany could not redeploy critical panzer reserves from the east to counter the Allied beachheads in Normandy. At the same time, the Allied bombing campaign crippled German fuel production and transportation, compounding the disaster. Together, these offensives represented the very essence of coalition warfare: separate armies, separated by thousands of miles, striking in harmony to achieve a shared objective. Germany's overstretched forces were caught in a trap from which there was no escape. Bagration's success amplified the effectiveness of D-Day, just as D-Day ensured the Soviets faced fewer reinforcements in Belorussia. For the Western Allies, Bagration provided a striking demonstration of Soviet military power, cementing the Red Army's role as the dominant force in the fight against Germany. American and British commanders, studying the scale of Soviet operations, realized that the Eastern Front had become the decisive theater where the Reich's fate would be sealed. While Allied armies fought hard battles in Normandy and Italy, it was the destruction of entire German field armies in the East that doomed Hitler's regime. This recognition influenced post-war diplomacy as Churchill and Roosevelt began to understand that Stalin would emerge from the war not only as a military ally, but as a geopolitical rival. The Red Army's achievements in Belorussia and beyond ensured that Eastern Europe would fall under Soviet influence. Bagration was both a victory against Hitler and a signal of the power struggles that would shape the post-war world. The offensive also influenced German strategy in the West. as Hitler diverted precious resources to shore up the crumbling Eastern Front. Panzer divisions that might have blunted the Allied breakout in Normandy were withheld or redirected, leaving Rommel and his commanders without the strength they needed. German soldiers in France fought with determination, but their ranks were depleted by the demands of Bagration. The inability to balance these two crises revealed the fatal flaw in Hitler's strategic vision, a refusal to prioritize and adapt. The simultaneous hammer blows left him lashing out in every direction, but unable to achieve victory anywhere. As Soviet tanks surged toward the Vistula and Allied forces pushed beyond Cannes, the Reich faced disaster on a scale it could no longer conceal. Bagration ensured that Germany's defense in the West was undermined before it even began. On a global scale, Operation Bagration contributed to the accelerated unraveling of the Axis alliance. Japan, reeling from defeats in the Pacific, watched Germany's collapse with growing despair, knowing that the loss of its European partner would leave it isolated. Italy had already fallen, its fascist regime replaced by Allied control, leaving Germany as the last pillar of Axis strength. With Bagration's success, the perception of inevitable Allied victory solidified worldwide. Neutral states, once cautious, began distancing themselves from Berlin, seeking to avoid association with a doomed power. The Soviet Union, once seen as vulnerable in 1941, now stood as a colossus bestriding Europe. The ripple effects of the Belarusian offensive extended beyond Europe, shaping the diplomatic currents of a global war. Bagration was not only a military operation, but a moment when the entire world recognized the Reich's impending collapse. Ultimately, Operation Bagration linked the fate of Eastern and Western Europe in a single narrative of destruction and liberation. It was the Soviet counterpart to D-Day, the Eastern hammer that struck simultaneously with the Western blow. Together, these offensives ensured that Germany could no longer dictate the tempo of the war. Instead, it was reduced to reacting desperately to Allied initiatives, always one step behind events, spiraling out of control. The connection between Normandy and Belorussia revealed the power of coordination in a global conflict, where victory depended not only on battlefield heroics, but on the synchronization of entire coalitions. For the people of Belorussia and France alike, summer 1944 marked the beginning of the end of Nazi occupation. For the world, it marked the shift from uncertainty to inevitability. Hitler's empire was collapsing, squeezed by the combined might of East and West, and Operation Bagration was the blow that made survival impossible. Operation Bagration stands as the greatest single victory of the Soviet Union in World War II, an offensive whose scale and success eclipsed even Stalingrad and Kursk in its immediate consequences. Launched on June 22, 1944, the third anniversary of Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, it carried immense symbolic weight as a reversal of Barbarossa itself. In just over a month, the Red Army shattered Army Group Center, once considered the backbone of German power in the East, reducing it to little more than scattered remnants. The Soviets advanced hundreds of miles, liberating all of Belorussia and pushing deep into Poland, opening the road to Warsaw. The victory was not measured merely in ground gained, but in the utter annihilation of German strength. Over 300,000 German soldiers were killed, captured, or missing, representing one of the greatest military disasters in history. The scale of this destruction shocked the world, cementing Bagration as a turning point in global memory. Its legacy would forever define the trajectory of the Eastern Front. For the Soviet Union, Bagration represented the culmination of years of rebuilding and adaptation after the disasters of 1941. It was proof that the Red Army had evolved into a modern war machine, capable of planning and executing massive, complex operations. Maskirovka, the art of deception, ensured that the Germans were caught off guard, while overwhelming firepower and air superiority completed the collapse. Bagration was not a lucky strike. It was a carefully orchestrated demonstration of Soviet military doctrine at its peak. The Red Army proved that it could coordinate multiple fronts, integrate partisans, and maintain relentless logistical support across hundreds of miles. This achievement fed directly into the growing Soviet confidence that they could not only defend their homeland, but dominate Eastern Europe. In Moscow's narrative, Bagration became a symbol of inevitable victory, a triumph that justified both the sacrifices of the war and the growing Soviet presence in Europe's post-war order. The destruction of Army Group Center marked one of the most catastrophic defeats ever suffered by the German Wehrmacht. Unlike Stalingrad, where a single army was surrounded, Bagration obliterated an entire army group, consisting of 4 separate armies. German divisions ceased to exist, their names stricken from order of battle charts, and their standards lost forever. This collapse destroyed the myth of German invincibility in the East, proving that Hitler's armies could not withstand the full weight of Soviet power. The Wehrmacht, already strained in France after D-Day, could no longer recover from such losses. No matter how many new tanks or weapons the Reich produced, it could not replace the trained soldiers and officers lost in Belorussia. The destruction was so complete that German defenses in the east never truly recovered. From July 1944 until the end of the war, Germany fought only delaying actions, unable to launch another major offensive. Bagration was the beginning of the end. Politically, Operation Bagration shaped the post-war world as decisively as it shaped the battlefield. By liberating Belorussia and advancing into Poland, the Red Army placed itself firmly in Central Europe, where it would remain for decades. Stalin's forces not only broke German power, but positioned themselves to dictate the future of Eastern Europe. For the Western Allies, this was both a blessing and a warning. The Soviet Union was carrying the heaviest burden of the war, but it was also expanding its influence. Bagration thus fed into the emerging fault lines of the Cold War. Churchill and Roosevelt celebrated the victory, but worried about its implications. As Soviet troops marched westward, they carried not only guns but ideology. The political legacy of Bagration was therefore twofold. It helped end the war, but also set the stage for the division of Europe. For the people of Belorussia, Operation Bagration was both liberation and devastation. Cities like Minsk lay in ruins, villages had been burned, and millions were displaced or dead. The offensive brought freedom from Nazi occupation, but at an enormous human cost. Survivors emerged from forests and ruins to find their homes gone and their families scattered. The suffering endured by civilians became part of the collective memory of the region, woven into its identity for generations. Soviet propaganda celebrated the victory as proof of the Red Army's heroism, but the lived experience was far more complex. Liberation came with famine, destruction, and fresh burdens under Soviet rule. Still, for those who endured 3 years of Nazi occupation, the collapse of German power in Belorussia was a moment of profound relief. The memory of suffering and sacrifice became inseparable from the legacy of victory. Globally, Operation Bagration demonstrated the effectiveness of coalition strategy in World War II. Though planned independently, it coincided with the Allied invasion of Normandy, creating a two-front crisis that Germany could not survive. The simultaneous offensives in France and Belorussia epitomized the Allies' ability to synchronize their efforts across continents. Germany, stretched thin and unable to reinforce one front without weakening another, collapsed under the combined weight of East and West. Historians later judged this coordination as one of the decisive achievements of the Allied war effort. Bagration was therefore not just a Soviet victory, but a global one, proving that unity could overcome even the most formidable military machine. It reshaped not only the Eastern Front, but the wider course of the war, ensuring that Germany's fate was sealed in 1944. In military history, Bagration remains a textbook example of operational excellence and overwhelming force. Scholars study it as a model of how deception, concentration of power, and coordination can achieve decisive results. Unlike many battles where victory was won by attrition, Bagration showcased how speed, surprise, and depth could achieve annihilation. The Red Army's ability to encircle, isolate, and destroy German forces set a precedent for modern doctrines of deep battle. It proved that wars could be won not only by grinding down the enemy, but by striking at their very foundation. For modern strategists, the lessons of Bagration remain relevant, demonstrating how a well-executed offensive can break an enemy's will and capacity to fight. Its legacy endures in military academies as one of the greatest examples of operational art in history. Ultimately, the legacy of Operation Bagration lies in its dual identity as both triumph and tragedy. It was the moment when the Soviet Union emerged unquestionably as a superpower, capable of defeating Nazi Germany and reshaping Europe. It was also the moment when Belorussia suffered one of the darkest chapters in its history, with unimaginable loss and destruction. For Germany, it was the point of no return, the irreversible collapse of its eastern defenses. For the Allies, it was the fulfillment of coalition promises and the beginning of post-war competition. The memory of Bagration has lived on in commemorations, monuments, and history books, not only as a story of military genius, but as a reminder of war's human cost. It stands as a symbol of victory bought with sacrifice, a lesson in both the power of unity and the devastation of total war. Above all, it marks the moment when the course of World War II turned decisively and irreversibly against the Third Reich.